When you ask someone to define a word, they typically respond with other words. When you ask them to define those words, they use still more words. This seemingly infinite regress reveals a logical puzzle at the heart of meaning itself. Each definition depends on terms that themselves require definition, creating a web where no element can claim absolute foundation. Jacques Derrida transforms this puzzle into a systematic challenge to Western philosophy's core assumptions. Rather than treating this regress as a problem to solve, he argues it reveals something fundamental about how meaning operates. His analysis suggests that what we take to be stable, self-evident foundations of thought are actually constructed through complex systems of differences and deferrals. Part 1. The logic of deconstruction-dismantling foundational claims. Deconstruction operates through a rigorously systematic analytical procedure that targets the hierarchical binary oppositions structuring Western metaphysical thought. Derrida identifies paired concepts like speech over writing, presence over absence, nature over culture, soul over body, and demonstrates how each supposedly superior term logically depends on the inferior term it claims to exclude. This dependence relationship creates an internal contradiction within the hierarchy's foundational logic. The analytical strength lies not merely in reversing these hierarchies, but in exposing the structural impossibility of maintaining stable hierarchical relationships between interdependent terms. The logical mechanism operates through three distinct analytical stages that must be distinguished to understand deconstruction's precision. First, the traditional hierarchy is identified and its internal logic examined to reveal hidden dependencies. Second, the hierarchy undergoes strategic reversal to expose how the privileged term secretly relies on what it subordinates. Third, this reversal generates a new conceptual space where neither term can claim foundational priority, revealing the undecidable structure underlying apparently stable oppositions. Consider the foundational speech versus writing hierarchy that dominates Western philosophical tradition from Plato through Husserl. This hierarchy treats speech as immediate self-presence, where meaning appears directly to consciousness, while writing represents a fallen, mediated form that distances meaning from its living source. Philosophers consistently characterize speech as natural, authentic and internally related to thought, while writing appears artificial, derivative, and externally imposed on pure meaning. This characterization supports broader metaphysical commitments to presence, immediacy, and self-evident foundations. Derrida's analysis reveals the logical contradiction embedded within this hierarchical structure by examining what must be true for speech to function as meaningful communication. Speech achieves meaning only through its capacity for repetition across different contexts, recognition by different listeners, and survival beyond the speaker's immediate presence. This repeatability requirement exposes the logical flaw. Speech works as communication precisely because it possesses the structural characteristics philosophers attribute exclusively to writing. The supposedly immediate presence of speech depends on its ability to function in the absence of original context, speaker, and intended meaning. The argument's logical force emerges through concrete analysis of how signs actually operate in communicative practices. When someone says, "I am here now," the meaning depends not on the speaker's immediate presence, but on the phrase's capacity to be understood regardless of who speaks it when or where. The indexical terms I, here, and now function meaningfully only because they can be iterated by different speakers in different contexts while maintaining recognizable semantic structure. This iterability reveals that meaningful speech requires the very structural independence from origin that philosophers dismiss as writing's deficiency. However, this analysis faces a sophisticated objection regarding the distinction between meaning and reference. Critics might argue that while the semantic structure of "I am here now" remains constant across iterations, the referential content changes with each speaker and context. This objection suggests that speech maintains privileged access to immediate referential presence, even if semantic meaning operates through repeatable structures. Derrida's response penetrates deeper into the logic of reference itself, showing how referential determination depends on contextual frameworks that cannot themselves be immediately present to consciousness. The analysis extends to examine how context itself operates through differential relationships rather than immediate presence. Any attempt to fully determine context encounters an infinite regress. The context that determines meaning must itself be contextualized, requiring further contextual determination without end. This regress reveals that contextual determination operates through what Derrida terms iterative structure, the systematic relationship between repetition and alteration that enables meaningful communication. The logical implication undermines the speech/writing hierarchy by showing how both operate through identical structural mechanisms. The analytical procedure's power emerges when applied to test cases that challenge its scope and precision. Consider mathematical discourse, which appears to achieve perfect self-presence through formal symbolic relationships independent of contextual variation. Mathematical signs seem to escape iterative uncertainty by maintaining identical meaning across all possible contexts of use. Derrida's analysis reveals how mathematical formalization itself depends on graphical inscription systems that operate through precisely the spacing, repetition, and contextual variation that characterize writing. Mathematical proof procedures demonstrate this dependency through their reliance on step-by-step inscriptional processes. Each proof step must be recorded, verified, and transmitted through material marks that can be recognized and repeated by different mathematicians at different times. The logical validity of mathematical reasoning depends not on immediate mental presence, but on the material possibility of inscriptional verification and transmission. This dependency reveals how even the most apparently self-present forms of meaning operate through the structural characteristics that deconstruction identifies as writing in general. The argument's logical structure raises critical questions about its own methodological foundations. If deconstruction reveals the impossibility of stable foundational hierarchies, how does it avoid undermining its own analytical procedures and conclusions? This reflexivity problem creates a potential performative contradiction. Deconstruction appears to rely on the very logical stability it systematically undermines. The objection suggests that deconstructive analysis requires determinate logical relationships that its own conclusions render impossible. Derrida's response to this reflexivity challenge operates through a sophisticated logical maneuver that avoids both foundationalist and relativist conclusions. Deconstruction does not claim to establish new foundations or demonstrate the impossibility of all foundations. Instead, it analyzes how foundational structures necessarily generate the instabilities they attempt to exclude, revealing undecidability as a structural condition rather than a methodological failure. This analysis operates through what Derrida terms quasi-transcendental logic that examines the conditions of possibility and impossibility simultaneously. The quasi-transcendental approach examines how traditional transcendental analysis, which seeks universal conditions of possibility, necessarily encounters conditions that both enable and disable the phenomena under investigation. Speech becomes possible through iterative structures that simultaneously make determinate meaning impossible to guarantee. Writing enables meaningful communication while introducing the spacing and temporal delay that prevent immediate self-presence. These conditions operate as what Derrida terms conditions of impossibility, structural requirements that enable phenomena while preventing their full realization according to traditional conceptual frameworks. The logical precision emerges through detailed analysis of specific philosophical texts, where foundational arguments encounter their own internal limitations. In Husserl's phenomenological analysis of time consciousness, the attempt to establish present experience as foundational encounters the necessary retention of past moments and protension toward future ones. This temporal synthesis reveals that the living present depends on non-present elements that contaminate its claimed self-identity. Derrida's reading shows how Husserl's own analysis generates conclusions that exceed and undermine his foundationalist intentions. The analytical procedure extends beyond individual philosophical arguments to examine how entire conceptual systems maintain their apparent coherence through systematic exclusions. Western metaphysics achieves theoretical unity by subordinating everything that threatens logical determinacy: materiality, temporality, difference, and iterability. These exclusions create what Derrida terms violent hierarchies that maintain conceptual order through the suppression of structural conditions that both enable and threaten systematic closure. The analysis reveals how metaphysical systems necessarily depend on what they systematically exclude, creating internal tensions that deconstruction traces and amplifies. Part 2. Difference, the temporal spacing of meaning. Difference operates as Derrida's most systematic attempt to think beyond the binary oppositions that structure traditional metaphysics. This neologism combines two French verbs, differe, meaning to differ, and differ, meaning to defer or delay. The identical pronunciation but distinct spelling reveals how meaning operates through relationships that cannot be reduced to either spatial difference or temporal deferral alone. Difference describes the simultaneous movement of differentiation and temporalization that makes meaningful experience possible while preventing its full presence to consciousness. The logical structure of difference challenges traditional analyses that separate space and time as distinct dimensions of experience. Classical metaphysics treats spatial relationships as simultaneous and given, while temporal relationships unfold through sequential succession. Derrida's analysis reveals how this separation creates artificial problems by obscuring the spacing that operates within temporality and the temporalization that operates within spatiality. Meaningful experience requires both spatial differentiation between elements and temporal synthesis across moments, but these requirements cannot be met independently of each other. Consider how linguistic meaning depends on systematic relationships between phonemic differences that must be maintained across temporal duration. The phoneme P differs from B through distinctive features that remain recognizable across different speeds, accents, and acoustic contexts. This recognizability requires spatial differentiation between acoustic properties and temporal synthesis that maintains identity through variation. Neither the spatial differences nor the temporal synthesis can establish meaning independently. Each depends on the other in what Derrida terms originary synthesis. The analysis penetrates deeper by examining how this synthesis operates through what cannot be present to consciousness. When you hear a word, its meaning emerges not from immediate acoustic presence, but from systematic relationships to absent phonemes, past uses, and future possibilities. The present acoustic event achieves meaning through traces of what is not currently present. The phonemes it differs from, the contexts where it previously appeared, and the semantic possibilities it opens. This dependency on absent elements reveals how presence itself operates through non-presence in ways that traditional metaphysics cannot acknowledge. Difference exposes the logical contradiction within Husserlian phenomenology's attempt to ground experience in living presence. Husserl's analysis of time consciousness shows how the present moment depends on retention of past phases and pretension toward future phases. This temporal synthesis enables unified experience, but violates phenomenology's foundational commitment to immediate self-presence. The living present contains non-present elements as structurally necessary components, not accidental additions. The logical implications extend to challenge the entire metaphysical framework that privileges presence over absence. Traditional metaphysics treats presence as positive reality and absence as mere negation or privation of presence. Difference reveals how this hierarchy inverts actual dependencies. Presence emerges through complex syntheses of temporal retention, spatial differentiation, and iterative repetition that cannot themselves be present. The supposedly foundational present depends on structural processes that operate prior to the distinction between presence and absence. However, this analysis encounters sophisticated objections regarding its relationship to traditional logical principles. Critics argue that difference violates the principle of non-contradiction by describing something that simultaneously differs and differs, is and is not present. This objection suggests that Derrida's analysis collapses into logical incoherence by refusing to respect fundamental logical distinctions. The objection gains force by noting how difference appears to occupy an impossible logical position that cannot be consistently described or defended. Derrida's response operates through careful analysis of how traditional logic itself depends on temporal and spatial operations that exceed its explicit principles. The principle of non-contradiction requires temporal duration to distinguish between simultaneous and successive states of affairs. Logical identity depends on iterative recognition that maintains sameness through repetition across different contexts. These requirements reveal how logical principles operate through the very temporal spacing that difference describes, suggesting that logic presupposes rather than excludes differential relationships. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of concrete cases where logical determination encounters its own limits. Mathematical proof procedures demonstrate this when formal systems encounter undecidable propositions that cannot be proven or disproven within the system's axioms. Gödel's incompleteness theorems reveal how formal systems necessarily contain statements whose truth value cannot be determined through the system's own resources. This undecidability does not represent logical failure but exposes structural limits inherent in systematic formalization. Difference provides analytical tools for understanding how these limits operate through temporal spacing rather than logical contradiction. Undecidable propositions maintain their logical form while deferring determinate resolution, creating spaces where systematic closure cannot be achieved. These spaces do not violate logical principles, but reveal how logical determination operates through temporal processes that cannot themselves be logically determined. The analysis suggests that what appears as logical contradiction may actually indicate the temporal spacing through which logical relationships emerge and operate. The concept's analytical power extends to examination of how difference operates in non-linguistic phenomena. Biological processes demonstrate differential structure through genetic replication that maintains identity through systematic variation and temporal development. DNA sequences achieve functional identity through copying mechanisms that introduce mutations while maintaining recognizable structural patterns. This biological iterability reveals how living systems operate through the same temporal spacing that characterizes linguistic meaning. The extension to biological phenomena raises questions about difference's scope and ontological status. If difference describes universal structural conditions, it appears to function as a new metaphysical principle that replaces traditional foundations with its own systematic claims. This interpretation suggests that Derrida reproduces the foundationalist gesture he claims to deconstruct, simply substituting difference for presence as the ultimate explanatory principle. The objection challenges whether deconstruction can maintain its critical stance without falling into new forms of metaphysical dogmatism. Derrida addresses this challenge by emphasizing that difference cannot be conceptualized as a foundational principle because it describes the structural impossibility of foundations. Difference names the temporal spacing that prevents any element from achieving full self-presence, including difference itself. This auto-deconstructive structure means that difference cannot ground a new metaphysical system because it describes precisely what prevents systematic grounding. The analysis operates through what Derrida terms paleonymic strategy, using traditional metaphysical terms while indicating their transformation through deconstructive analysis. Part 3. The critique of presence-metaphysics and time. Western metaphysics constructs systematic unity through what Derrida identifies as the metaphysics of presence, the theoretical commitment that treats immediate self-presence as the foundation of knowledge, reality, and truth. This commitment manifests across diverse philosophical traditions that nevertheless share the assumption that authentic reality must be immediately available to consciousness without temporal delay or spatial mediation. From Platonic forms through Cartesian certainty to Husserlian intuition, metaphysical systems privilege whatever appears to consciousness with complete self-evidence and transparency. Derrida's critique reveals how this privilege of presence creates systematic blindness to the temporal conditions that make presence itself possible. The logical structure of presence metaphysics operates through hierarchical oppositions that consistently privilege terms associated with immediacy, identity, and self-evidence. Presence over absence, identity over difference, speech over writing, soul over body, meaning over signification. Each hierarchy maintains philosophical coherence by subordinating whatever introduces temporal delay or spatial separation. This systematic subordination enables metaphysical thinking to maintain theoretical unity by excluding structural elements that threaten immediate self-presence. The exclusions are not accidental, but necessary for preserving the foundational role that presence plays across metaphysical systems. Derrida's analysis demonstrates how this systematic privileging of presence encounters internal contradictions when examined through rigorous temporal analysis. The attempt to establish immediate presence as foundational must account for how present experience achieves determinacy and recognition. Any present moment gains meaning through relationships to past experiences that inform current recognition and future possibilities that guide present interpretation. These temporal relationships introduce non-present elements into the supposedly immediate present, creating logical tensions that presence metaphysics cannot resolve through its own theoretical resources. Consider Husserl's phenomenological attempt to ground knowledge in immediate intuitive presence. Husserlian phenomenology seeks to establish apodictic certainty through careful description of whatever appears immediately to consciousness without theoretical presuppositions. This method requires bracketing all assumptions about external reality to focus exclusively on phenomena as they present themselves to pure consciousness. The phenomenological reduction aims to isolate a sphere of absolute self-presence, where consciousness encounters itself without mediation or distortion. However, Husserl's own temporal analysis reveals the structural impossibility of immediate self-presence. The analysis of time consciousness shows how present experience depends necessarily on retention of just past phases and pretension toward coming phases. These temporal syntheses enable unified experience by maintaining identity across temporal flow, but they violate the phenomenological requirement for immediate self-presence. The living present contains retentions and pretensions that are structurally non-present. They operate as traces of what is no longer or not yet immediate to consciousness. The logical contradiction deepens when Husserl attempts to account for intersubjective experience within the phenomenological framework. Other consciousness cannot be immediately present to ego consciousness, yet intersubjective recognition appears essential for objective knowledge and meaningful communication. Husserl introduces analogical appresentation to explain how ego consciousness can intend other subjectivity through bodily signs that indicate, without directly presenting, alter ego consciousness. This analogical structure introduces systematic mediation into the heart of phenomenological immediacy, revealing how self-presence depends on relationships that cannot themselves be present. The analysis extends to examine how Heidegger's fundamental ontology attempts to overcome presence-metaphysics while remaining trapped within its temporal assumptions. Heidegger criticizes traditional metaphysics for reducing being to present-at-hand entities that appear as objects for theoretical contemplation. Being in the world reveals more fundamental temporal structures through which entities become accessible within practical contexts of engaged activity. However, Heidegger's analysis of authentic temporality privileges futural projection and retrieval of past possibilities in ways that maintain temporal hierarchy and the quest for foundational self-understanding. Derrida's reading reveals how Heideggerian temporality reproduces presence metaphysics at a deeper level by privileging authentic moments of vision where Dasein achieves transparent self-understanding. The moment of vision gathers past, present, and future into unified temporal experience that enables authentic decision and action. This gathering maintains the metaphysical privilege of self-presence by locating authenticity in moments where temporal dispersion collapses into immediate self-transparency. The analysis shows how even sophisticated critiques of presence metaphysics can reproduce its fundamental structure through new forms of temporal immediacy. The critique encounters objections regarding its relationship to lived temporal experience and practical knowledge. Critics argue that Derrida's analysis reduces all temporal experience to textual structures that ignore the embodied immediacy of practical engagement with worldly situations. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis imposes theoretical sophistication that distorts rather than illuminates actual temporal experience. The objection gains force by noting how practical activities like musical performance or athletic skill demonstrate forms of embodied presence that resist theoretical reduction to differential structures. Derrida's response operates through careful analysis of how embodied presence itself depends on temporal synthesis and spatial differentiation that cannot be immediately present to consciousness. Musical performance requires precise temporal coordination between auditory recognition, motor response, and anticipatory preparation that operates through complex syntheses of retention and pretension. Athletic skill depends on embodied memory traces that enable rapid response to changing situations without conscious deliberation. These forms of embodied expertise demonstrate temporal complexity rather than immediate presence, revealing how skillful activity operates through sophisticated syntheses that exceed conscious awareness. The analysis reveals how presence-metaphysics obscures rather than illuminates the temporal conditions that enable both theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. By privileging immediate self-presence, metaphysical thinking systematically excludes attention to the temporal syntheses, spatial differentiations, and iterative repetitions through which meaningful experience emerges. This exclusion creates theoretical problems that cannot be solved within the metaphysical framework because they result from the framework's foundational commitments rather than accidental theoretical errors. The critique suggests that overcoming these problems requires thinking temporal relationships in ways that do not subordinate them to presence. However, the critique faces the reflexivity challenge. If presence metaphysics structures Western thought systematically, how can critique operate outside its determining influence? The objection suggests that Derrida's analysis necessarily employs metaphysical concepts and logical relationships while claiming to reveal their limitations. This creates potential performative contradiction, where deconstructive critique depends on the very metaphysical resources it systematically undermines. The objection challenges whether critique can achieve the analytical distance necessary for effective deconstruction of its own conceptual conditions. Derrida addresses this challenge through paleonymic strategy that operates within metaphysical language while indicating its transformation through deconstructive analysis. The strategy does not claim to achieve position outside metaphysics, but works to reveal internal tensions and contradictions that exceed metaphysical containment. This approach treats metaphysical concepts as necessary but insufficient tools that enable analysis while undergoing transformation through their deconstructive employment. The strategy suggests that effective critique operates through strategic inhabitation rather than external opposition to metaphysical discourse. Part 4. Logocentrism, the privilege of rational speech. Logocentrism describes the systematic privilege that Western thought accords to rational speech as the paradigmatic form of meaningful communication and self-present knowledge. This privilege treats spoken language as naturally and immediately connected to thought, while written language appears derivative, artificial, and prone to misunderstanding. The logocentric tradition extends from Plato's critique of writing in the Phaedrus through modern linguistic theory's treatment of speech as primary and writing as secondary representation. Derrida's analysis reveals how this privilege of speech supports broader metaphysical commitments to presence, identity, and rational transparency, while systematically excluding structural elements that threaten these foundations. The logical architecture of logocentrism operates through the assumption that rational speech provides immediate access to meaning because spoken words appear to emerge directly from thinking consciousness. Unlike written marks that exist independently of their author's presence, spoken words seem to maintain direct connection between thought and expression through the speaker's living intention. This immediacy suggests that speech can achieve transparent communication, where meaning passes directly from speaker to listener without the mediations and distortions that affect written communication. The assumption enables theoretical frameworks that treat rational discourse as capable of achieving objective truth through careful attention to logical relationships and conceptual precision. However, Derrida's analysis demonstrates how this privilege of speech depends on systematic forgetting of the structural conditions that enable spoken communication to function meaningfully. Speech achieves communication only through phonemic systems that operate through differential relationships between acoustic elements. These differential systems require spatial separation between phonemes and temporal synthesis across acoustic duration, precisely the spacing that logocentrism attributes exclusively to writing. The analysis reveals how speech functions through structural characteristics that contradict its privileged status within logocentric hierarchy. The contradiction deepens when examining how spoken communication achieves intersubjective understanding. Meaningful speech requires shared linguistic competence that enables speakers and listeners to recognize phonetic patterns as significant utterances. This competence operates through learned associations between acoustic events and semantic content that depend on iterative training across multiple contexts and speakers. The iterative structure introduces the very repetition and contextual variation that logocentrism treats as corruptions of immediate speech, revealing how rational communication depends on processes it cannot acknowledge. Consider Plato's critique of writing in the Phaedrus, which establishes the foundational terms for subsequent logocentric thought. Plato argues that writing weakens memory, promotes superficial learning, and enables misinterpretation because written texts cannot respond to questions or correct misunderstandings. Living speech appears superior because the speaker can clarify ambiguities, respond to objections, and ensure that communication achieves its intended effect. This argument treats speech as philosophically superior because it maintains connection to the speaker's rational intention and knowledge. Derrida's analysis reveals how Plato's argument contains internal contradictions that undermine its own logocentric assumptions. The critique of writing depends on characterizing speech through metaphors of inscription, marking, and spatial relationship that derive from writing itself. Plato describes memory as wax tablet that receives impressions, learning as inscription of knowledge on the soul, and dialectical questioning as process of examining marks left by previous inquiry. These metaphors suggest that speech and thought operate through the very structural characteristics that the argument attributes exclusively to writing. The logical contradiction extends to Plato's positive account of philosophical dialogue as paradigmatic rational activity. Dialectical questioning achieves knowledge through systematic examination of definitions, assumptions, and logical relationships that must be maintained across extended temporal development. This maintenance requires what Derrida terms inscription of logical relationships that enables recognition and repetition across different dialogical contexts. The dialectical process depends on structural repeatability that contradicts the immediate presence that supposedly distinguishes speech from writing. Modern linguistic theory reproduces these logocentric assumptions through its treatment of speech as natural and primary, while written language appears conventional and derivative. Ferdinand de Saussure establishes structural linguistics by focusing exclusively on spoken language and treating writing as external representation that threatens linguistic purity. This methodological decision enables systematic analysis of synchronic linguistic relationships, but reproduces metaphysical hierarchies that privilege presence over representation. Saussure's analysis of linguistic value through differential relationships actually provides resources for deconstructing the speech-writing hierarchy, but these implications remain unthought within structuralist frameworks. Derrida's reading of Saussure reveals how structural linguistics contains analytical tools that exceed its own logocentric framework. The analysis of linguistic value shows how signification operates through systematic relationships between differences rather than positive terms that maintain independent identity. No phoneme possesses inherent meaning, but achieves significance through its differential relationships within the phonological system. This differential structure applies equally to speech and writing, suggesting that both operate through identical structural mechanisms that contradict their hierarchical arrangement within linguistic theory. The analysis extends to examine how contemporary speech-act theory attempts to maintain logocentric privilege through sophisticated attention to contextual factors in communication. Austin and Searle develop pragmatic frameworks that analyze how spoken utterances perform actions through felicity conditions that ensure successful communication. These frameworks appear to overcome traditional neglect of contextual factors while maintaining the privilege of speech through attention to speaker intention and contextual appropriateness. However, the analysis of speech acts reveals dependence on citational structures that operate through the iterability that logocentric thought attempts to exclude. Speech acts achieve performative force through their capacity for recognition and repetition across different contexts, rather than through immediate connection to speaker intention. The utterance "I promise" performs promissory commitment only because it cites conventional formulas that have been established through previous iterations in similar contexts. This citational structure reveals how performative success depends on what Derrida terms iterative drift that enables recognition while preventing identical repetition. The analysis shows how speech act theory's sophistication actually supports deconstructive insights while maintaining explicit commitment to logocentric hierarchy. However, the critique of logocentrism encounters objections regarding its treatment of rational argument and philosophical analysis. Critics argue that deconstructive analysis undermines the possibility of rational discourse by reducing logical relationships to rhetorical effects that cannot maintain stable meaning. This objection suggests that the critique of logocentrism necessarily leads to relativism that cannot distinguish between valid and invalid arguments. The objection gains force by noting how deconstructive analysis appears to employ rational argumentation while systematically undermining confidence in rational procedures. Derrida's response operates through careful analysis of how rational argumentation itself depends on rhetorical and citational structures that exceed purely logical determination. Logical arguments achieve persuasive force through their capacity for recognition and transmission across different contexts and audiences rather than through immediate self-evidence. This transmissibility requires the very iterative structures that enable both logical reasoning and rhetorical persuasion. The analysis suggests that the opposition between logic and rhetoric reproduces metaphysical hierarchies that obscure their structural interdependence, rather than providing tools for distinguishing valid from invalid reasoning. Part 5. Trace structure, the mark of absence in presence. The concept of trace operates as Derrida's most fundamental analytical tool for examining how present experience depends structurally on absent elements that cannot be reduced to modifications or negations of presence. Unlike traditional concepts of sign or representation that treat absence as secondary to presence, trace describes the constitutive role that non-presence plays in enabling any present element to appear and function meaningfully. This analysis reveals how what appears as immediate and self-present actually emerges through complex relationships to what is systematically absent. Past origins that can no longer be recovered and future destinations that cannot be predetermined. Trace structure challenges traditional metaphysical frameworks by showing how presence and absence operate through interdependent relationships rather than hierarchical oppositions. The logical structure of trace operates through what Derrida terms arche-writing. a structural condition that enables both speech and conventional writing while being reducible to neither. Arche-writing describes the spacing and temporalization that must operate for any meaningful element to achieve identity through relationship to other elements. This spacing is not spatial in the geometric sense, nor temporal in the chronological sense, but describes the differential relationships through which spatial and temporal determination become possible. The concept provides analytical tools for examining how seemingly immediate phenomena depend on structural relationships that cannot themselves be immediately present. Consider how memory operates through trace structure rather than present recollection of past experiences. Traditional analysis treats memory as mental reproduction that makes past events present again to consciousness through representative images or concepts. This model assumes that successful memory involves accurate correspondence between present recollection and past original experience. Derrida's analysis reveals how this model obscures the structural conditions that enable memory to operate as meaningful temporal synthesis rather than mere reproductive repetition. Memory functions through traces that are neither present reproductions of past experiences nor absent marks that point toward lost origins. The trace enables recognition of past significance without reproducing past presence, maintaining temporal relationship without temporal identity. This operation requires what Derrida terms retention without representation, the structural maintenance of past significance that operates below the threshold of conscious recollection. Retentional traces enable present experience to achieve determinacy through relationships to past contexts, while preventing past experiences from achieving full presence within current consciousness. The analysis extends to examine how linguistic meaning depends on trace structure rather than representative relationships between words and things. Traditional semantic theory treats meaningful language as a system of signs that represent absent objects to present consciousness through conventional associations. This model assumes that linguistic meaning depends on stable relationships between present signs and absent reference that can be established and maintained through social agreement. Derrida's analysis reveals how this model cannot account for the temporal and contextual variation that enables linguistic communication to function across different speakers and situations. Linguistic meaning operates through traces of previous uses that inform current signification without determining it completely. When someone uses the word tree, its meaning emerges not through direct reference to absent objects, but through traces of previous contexts where tree appeared with specific semantic force. These traces are neither present in consciousness nor absent from current usage, but operate as structural conditions that enable semantic recognition while allowing semantic innovation. The trace structure explains how language can maintain semantic stability across contextual variation while remaining open to new meanings and unexpected applications. However, this analysis encounters sophisticated objections regarding its relationship to intentional consciousness and meaningful action. Critics argue that trace structure reduces human agency to mechanical operation of structural forces that operate below conscious awareness and deliberate choice. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis eliminates the role of conscious intention in determining meaning and directing action. The objection gains force by noting how trace analysis appears to treat consciousness as epiphenomenal effect rather than active source of meaningful experience. Derrida's response operates through careful analysis of how conscious intention itself depends on trace structure rather than immediate self-presence. Intentional consciousness achieves directed activity through synthesis of retentional traces that inform current perception and potential anticipations that guide future action. This temporal synthesis operates through unconscious processes that enable conscious intention while exceeding conscious control. The analysis suggests that rather than eliminating agency, trace structure reveals the complex temporal conditions through which conscious intention emerges and operates effectively. The argument's precision emerges through examination of specific cases where conscious intention encounters its own temporal limits. Consider how skillful activity like musical performance depends on embodied memory traces that enable rapid response to changing musical situations. Expert musicians can improvise meaningfully because their training has created retentional traces that provide resources for creative response without conscious deliberation. These traces operate as enabling conditions for conscious choice rather than mechanical determinants that eliminate creative agency. The analysis reveals how trace structure operates across different domains of experience without reducing them to identical mechanisms. Biological traces in genetic reproduction, technological traces in computational processing, and cultural traces in traditional transmission each operate through domain-specific characteristics while sharing structural features that Derrida's analysis illuminates. This structural generality does not eliminate important differences between biological, technological, and cultural processes, but provides analytical tools for understanding their complex interdependencies. The trace concept enables analysis of how different domains influence each other through what Derrida terms general writing, that operates across traditional disciplinary boundaries. The extension to technological domains raises questions about the relationship between human trace structure and computational processing. Digital technologies operate through binary traces that maintain information through spatial arrangements of electrical states, rather than temporal memory synthesis. These technological traces appear to function through mechanical repetition that lacks the temporal complexity that characterizes human memory and linguistic meaning. However, Derrida's analysis reveals how digital processing depends on iterative operations that introduce spacing and temporal delay into apparently immediate computational operations. Computer programs achieve functional identity through iterative execution across different hardware contexts and temporal occasions. This iterability introduces variation and potential malfunction into computational processes that appear perfectly determinate and reliable. Software updates, hardware changes, and contextual variations create what Derrida terms technological unconscious that operates through trace structure rather than mechanical repetition. The analysis suggests that human and technological traces operate through structural relationships that cannot be reduced to simple opposition between natural and artificial processes. However, the generalization of trace structure to technological and biological domains encounters objections regarding conceptual precision and analytical utility. Critics argue that extending trace analysis beyond human linguistic and cultural phenomena eliminates important distinctions between different types of processes and relationships. This objection suggests that trace becomes an empty universal concept that cannot provide specific analytical insight into particular domains of experience. The objection challenges whether Derrida's analysis maintains sufficient conceptual precision to enable effective analysis of concrete phenomena rather than abstract theoretical speculation. Derrida addresses this challenge by emphasizing that trace structure operates through what he terms differential specification that maintains general structural features while enabling domain-specific analysis. The trace concept provides analytical framework for examining how different processes maintain identity through repetition while introducing variation that prevents identical reproduction. This framework enables analysis of specific mechanisms through which biological, technological, and cultural traces operate, while revealing structural relationships that traditional disciplinary boundaries obscure. The approach suggests that conceptual precision emerges through analysis of how general structures operate through particular specifications, rather than through abstract universalization that eliminates important differences. Part 6. Iterability-Repetition and Difference in Communication. Iterability describes the structural condition that enables linguistic signs to function meaningfully across different contexts, while preventing their meaning from being completely determined by any single context or intention. This concept combines iteration, the capacity for repetition, with alterity, the introduction of difference that prevents identical repetition. Every meaningful sign must be repeatable across different contexts to function as communication, but each repetition introduces contextual variations that alter semantic force and pragmatic effect. This structural relationship between repetition and alteration reveals how meaningful communication depends on processes that both enable and limit semantic determinacy. The logical precision of iterability emerges through analysis of what must be true for any sign to function as meaningful communication. Signs achieve meaning through their capacity for recognition across different speakers, contexts, and temporal occasions rather than through immediate connection to present intention or reference. This recognizability requires that signs maintain structural identity while remaining open to semantic innovation and contextual reinterpretation. The requirement creates what Derrida terms structural impossibility. Signs must remain identical through repetition while necessarily changing through each iteration. Consider how the utterance "I promise" functions as performative speech act across different contexts and speakers. The phrase achieves promissory force through its capacity for recognition as conventional formula that has been established through previous iterations in similar situations. However, each new utterance of "I promise" occurs in unique contextual circumstances that alter its semantic content and pragmatic implications. The same words can express different levels of commitment, refer to different promised actions, and create different social obligations depending on who speaks them, when, and under what circumstances. This contextual variation reveals how performative success depends on iterative structure rather than immediate connection to speaker intention. Austin's analysis of speech acts attempts to specify felicity conditions that ensure successful performative communication through attention to appropriate contexts and speaker authority. However, these conditions cannot be specified completely because they depend on iterative recognition that introduces unpredictable contextual variations into apparently determinate social conventions. The analysis shows how speech act theory's sophistication actually supports deconstructive insights about the structural indeterminacy that enables rather than threatens meaningful communication. Derrida's analysis reveals how this iterative indeterminacy operates in written communication as well, challenging traditional oppositions between speech and writing. Written texts achieve meaning through their capacity for reading across different contexts and temporal occasions without the author's presence to clarify intended meaning. This separation from authorial intention appears to threaten determinate communication by introducing possibilities for misinterpretation and semantic drift. However, Derrida's analysis shows how spoken communication depends on identical iterative structures that enable recognition while preventing complete semantic control. The argument's force emerges through concrete analysis of how literary texts demonstrate iterative structure in exemplary ways. Literary works like Shakespeare's plays achieve cultural significance through their capacity for reinterpretation across different historical periods and cultural contexts. Each new performance or interpretation actualizes different semantic possibilities that were not fully present in the original text, but were enabled by its iterative structure. This interpretive productivity reveals how meaningful texts operate through surplus of meaning that exceeds authorial intention while remaining constrained by textual structure. However, the analysis faces objections regarding its implications for communication theory and legal interpretation. Critics argue that iterative indeterminacy undermines the possibility of stable communication by making all meaning dependent on variable contextual factors that cannot be controlled or predicted. This objection suggests that Derrida's analysis leads to interpretive relativism that cannot distinguish between reasonable and unreasonable readings of texts or utterances. The objection gains force in legal contexts where determinate interpretation appears necessary for fair application of laws and contractual agreements. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how legal interpretation itself depends on iterative structure rather than determinate rule application. Legal systems maintain stability through precedent that enables similar cases to be decided through reference to previous judicial decisions. However, no two cases are identical, so legal precedent requires analogical reasoning that determines which similarities and differences are legally relevant. This analogical process operates through iterative judgment that cannot be reduced to mechanical rule application, but requires interpretive decisions that introduce new legal meanings while maintaining systematic consistency. The analysis reveals how legal determinacy emerges through iterative processes rather than existing as stable foundation that iteration threatens. Successful legal interpretation requires attention both to established precedent and to novel aspects of current cases that may require innovative legal reasoning. This requirement creates what Derrida terms interpretive responsibility, that operates through careful attention to textual constraints and contextual demands without claiming to achieve perfect determinacy. The analysis suggests that legal interpretation operates most effectively when it acknowledges rather than denies the iterative indeterminacy that enables adaptive legal reasoning. The concept's analytical power extends to examination of how cultural transmission operates through iterative structure across historical periods. Cultural traditions maintain identity through repetition of practices, narratives and institutional forms while necessarily adapting to changing historical circumstances. This adaptive repetition enables cultural continuity while introducing innovations that prevent cultural traditions from remaining identical across time. Traditional cultures that attempt to maintain perfect identity through unchanging repetition actually cease to function as living traditions because they cannot respond to new historical challenges and opportunities. The analysis illuminates how cultural innovation operates through creative interpretation of inherited traditions rather than complete rejection or uncritical acceptance. Innovative cultural practices achieve legitimacy through their capacity to demonstrate continuity with established traditions while introducing modifications that address contemporary needs and possibilities. This process requires what Derrida terms inventive fidelity, that combines respect for traditional forms with creative response to unprecedented situations. The analysis reveals how cultural creativity depends on iterative structure that enables both preservation and transformation of inherited cultural resources. However, The extension of iterability to cultural and historical analysis encounters objections regarding its relationship to agency, power, and social transformation. Critics argue that emphasis on iterative structure obscures how differential power relationships determine which interpretations achieve social authority and which remain marginalized or excluded. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis provides inadequate resources for analyzing social inequality and political domination because it treats all interpretations as equally subject to iterative indeterminacy. The objection challenges whether Derrida's analysis can account for how social power operates through systematic exclusion of alternative interpretive possibilities. Derrida addresses this challenge through analysis of how iterative structure enables both hegemonic closure and resistant reinterpretation. Dominant interpretations achieve social authority through their capacity to present themselves as natural or inevitable, while actually depending on iterative repetition that can be interrupted or redirected. This dependency creates opportunities for counter-interpretations that reveal the constructedness of apparently natural social arrangements. The analysis suggests that effective political criticism operates through strategic employment of iterative possibilities rather than appeal to foundations that exist outside iterative processes. Part 7. The supplement logic of addition and replacement. The logic of supplementarity reveals how elements that appear as external additions to complete systems actually expose internal lacks that the system cannot acknowledge without threatening its claimed self-sufficiency. Supplements present themselves as helpful additions that enhance systematic completeness while simultaneously revealing that the system requires external elements to achieve the completeness it claims to possess independently. This paradoxical structure creates what Derrida terms dangerous supplement, an external element that both completes and threatens systematic closure by revealing internal inadequacy. The analysis demonstrates how Western metaphysics operates through systematic exclusion of supplementary elements that are necessary for systematic functioning, but cannot be acknowledged without undermining foundational claims. Derrida's analysis of supplementarity emerges through careful reading of Rousseau's theoretical attempts to establish natural foundations for human society, education, and political organization. Rousseau's theoretical framework depends on clear distinctions between natural and artificial, original and derived, essential and supplementary, that enable systematic criticism of social corruption and educational malpractice. However, Rousseau's own analysis repeatedly encounters situations where supposedly external supplements prove necessary for actualizing natural potentialities and achieving systematic completeness. These encounters reveal internal tensions within Rousseau's theoretical framework that exceed his conscious intention while remaining visible through careful textual analysis. Consider Rousseau's analysis of natural education in Émile, which attempts to establish pedagogical methods that develop human potentialities according to their natural order without artificial distortion. Natural education should enable children to develop authentic self-knowledge and autonomous judgment through carefully structured experiences that follow developmental patterns established by nature itself. This approach appears to avoid the corrupting influences of conventional education by maintaining strict separation between natural development and artificial social pressures. However, Rousseau's detailed pedagogical program reveals how natural education requires sophisticated artificial interventions that contradict its foundational commitment to natural immediacy. The tutor must carefully control Émile's environment, manipulate his experiences, and stage apparently natural encounters that are actually designed to produce predetermined educational effects. These interventions are necessary for natural education to achieve its intended results, but they violate the principle of natural immediacy that provides the program's theoretical foundation. The pedagogical supplements appear as external additions to natural development, while actually revealing that natural development requires artificial supplementation to achieve systematic completion. This dependency exposes internal inadequacy within the natural education program that cannot be resolved through appeal to natural foundations. The supplementary logic operates more systematically in Rousseau's analysis of the origin of languages and social institutions. The essay on the origin of languages attempts to trace human development from natural immediacy through social complexity while maintaining clear distinctions between original and derived forms. Language development should follow natural progression from immediate emotional expression through gestural communication to conventional spoken language that maintains connection to natural feeling. However, Rousseau's analysis reveals how each stage of linguistic development requires capacities that cannot be derived from previous stages, creating logical gaps that undermine developmental continuity. The transition from natural cry to meaningful gesture requires capacity for symbolic representation that cannot exist within immediate emotional expression. Similarly, the development from gesture to spoken language requires abstract conceptual thought that exceeds gestural representation. These developmental requirements reveal how linguistic evolution depends on supplementary capacities that must be presupposed rather than derived from natural origins. The supplements appear as external additions to natural development while actually providing necessary conditions that natural development cannot generate through its own resources. Derrida's analysis reveals how this supplementary structure operates across Rousseau's theoretical system rather than representing isolated theoretical problems. The social contract depends on supplementary political institutions that both complete and threaten natural freedom by introducing artificial constraints that are necessary for protecting natural rights. The discourse on inequality requires supplementary historical analysis that both explains and contradicts natural equality by showing how social differentiation emerges from natural conditions. These theoretical supplements reveal systematic tensions within Rousseau's philosophy that result from attempting to establish natural foundations while acknowledging social complexity that exceeds natural determination. The logic of supplementarity extends beyond Rousseau to analyze how Western metaphysics generally operates through systematic exclusion of elements that threaten foundational claims. Platonic philosophy establishes eternal forms as foundational reality while requiring temporal participation that introduces change and imperfection into supposedly perfect systematic unity. Cartesian dualism separates mind and body to establish mental certainty while requiring psychosomatic union that contradicts substantial independence. Husserlian phenomenology brackets natural attitude to achieve pure description, while requiring natural world as intentional correlate that threatens phenomenological reduction. Each case reveals how systematic philosophy depends on exclusions that are necessary for systematic functioning, but cannot be acknowledged without undermining systematic foundations. The excluded supplements operate as conditions of possibility that enable systematic construction while preventing systematic closure. This structural relationship between system and supplement reveals what Derrida terms logic of iterability that prevents systematic completion while enabling systematic development. The analysis suggests that rather than representing philosophical failures, supplementary relationships reveal structural conditions that enable philosophical thinking while preventing its completion in absolute knowledge. However, the analysis of supplementarity encounters objections regarding its relationship to systematic philosophy and rational analysis. Critics argue that deconstructive analysis of supplementary logic leads to skeptical relativism that cannot distinguish between valid and invalid philosophical arguments. This objection suggests that by revealing internal tensions within systematic philosophy, deconstruction eliminates the possibility of rational evaluation and constructive theoretical development. The objection gains force by noting how supplementary analysis appears to treat all philosophical systems as equally subject to internal contradiction and systematic failure. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how supplementary logic enables, rather than prevents, rigorous philosophical analysis. Recognition of supplementary relationships requires careful attention to textual details, logical relationships, and systematic implications that exceed superficial reading or dogmatic acceptance. Deconstructive analysis demonstrates higher levels of analytical precision than traditional philosophical criticism by revealing complex structural relationships that operate below conscious intention. This analytical sophistication suggests that supplementary logic provides resources for more rigorous philosophical evaluation rather than eliminating standards for rational assessment. The argument's force emerges through analysis of how supplementarity operates in contemporary theoretical contexts that attempt to avoid traditional metaphysical problems. Systems theory attempts to analyze complex phenomena through attention to systematic relationships and environmental interactions, while avoiding foundational claims about essential properties or natural teleologies. However, systems analysis depends on boundary distinctions between system and environment that operate through supplementary logic rather than systematic determination. Environmental elements appear as external to systematic operation, while actually providing necessary conditions for systematic maintenance and development. The analysis reveals how attempts to overcome traditional metaphysical problems through sophisticated theoretical frameworks often reproduce supplementary structures in new forms rather than achieving systematic resolution. This reproduction does not represent theoretical failure, but indicates structural conditions that operate across different theoretical approaches and historical periods. Recognition of supplementary logic provides analytical tools for understanding these structural conditions rather than eliminating them through theoretical sophistication. The analysis suggests that effective theoretical work requires strategic engagement with supplementary relationships rather than systematic attempts to achieve theoretical closure that exclude supplementary elements. Part 8. Archive, Fever Memory, Technology and Destruction. Archive fever describes the simultaneous drive to preserve and destroy that operates within all archival processes, revealing how attempts to maintain perfect memory necessarily introduce the technical mediations that threaten what they seek to preserve. This concept analyzes how archives function through technological processes that both enable preservation across time and introduce possibilities for corruption, loss, and systematic destruction. The archive's dependency on technical reproduction creates what Derrida terms maldarchive, a sickness or trouble within the archival process that cannot be cured without eliminating the archive's capacity to function across temporal distance. This structural relationship between preservation and destruction operates across individual memory, cultural transmission, and technological storage systems in ways that challenge traditional distinctions between natural and artificial memory. The logical structure of archive fever emerges through analysis of what must be true for any archive to function as temporal preservation. Archives maintain access to past events, documents, and experiences through technical reproduction that creates durable marks capable of surviving across temporal duration and spatial displacement. However, this technical reproduction necessarily introduces elements that are foreign to what is archived: material substrates, reproductive mechanisms, and interpretive frameworks that alter what they preserve. The archive's capacity to maintain temporal relationship depends on technical elements that prevent identical repetition of archived content, creating structural relationship between preservation and alteration that cannot be eliminated through improved archival technology. Consider how personal memory operates through archival processes, rather than immediate recollection of past experience. Individual memory depends on neurological traces that maintain patterns of synaptic connection across temporal duration while remaining subject to modification through subsequent experience and biological change. These traces are neither present reproductions of past events nor absent records that point toward lost origins, but operate as structural conditions that enable temporal synthesis while preventing perfect recollection. Memory traces function through what Derrida terms originary technicity, that reveals how biological memory operates through technical processes rather than natural immediacy. The analysis challenges traditional philosophical distinctions between natural memory and technical recording by revealing how both operate through structural relationships between preservation and alteration. Biological memory achieves temporal synthesis through technical processes of synaptic modification, protein synthesis, and neurological integration that introduce material changes into memory formation. These technical processes enable memory's temporal function while preventing memory from achieving perfect reproduction of past presence. The analysis suggests that rather than corrupting natural memory, technical recording reveals structural conditions that operate within all forms of temporal preservation. Derrida's analysis extends to examine how cultural archives operate through institutional practices that both preserve and transform cultural heritage across historical periods. Libraries, museums, and educational institutions maintain access to past cultural achievements through classification systems, preservation technologies, and interpretive practices that enable contemporary engagement with historical materials. However, these archival processes necessarily involve selection criteria, interpretive frameworks, and technological mediations that alter what they preserve by determining how it becomes available for contemporary access. Cultural archives reveal how preservation operates through transformation rather than identical repetition of past cultural content. The institutional dimension of cultural archiving creates what Derrida terms archival violence, that operates through decisions about what deserves preservation and what can be allowed to disappear. Archival institutions exercise interpretive authority by determining which documents, artworks, and cultural practices receive preservation resources and institutional support. These decisions operate through evaluative criteria that are historically variable and culturally specific rather than universal and timeless. The analysis reveals how cultural archives both preserve and systematically exclude alternative cultural possibilities, creating official cultural memory that obscures the selective processes through which it emerges. However, this analysis of archival violence encounters sophisticated objections regarding its implications for cultural preservation and institutional responsibility. Critics argue that recognition of archival selectivity leads to paralyzing relativism that cannot provide guidance for institutional decision-making about cultural preservation priorities. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis eliminates rather than enhances institutional capacity for responsible cultural stewardship. The objection gains force by noting how limited preservation resources require practical decisions about preservation priorities that cannot wait for theoretical resolution of archival paradoxes. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how recognition of archival complexity enables rather than prevents responsible institutional practice. Understanding archival processes as involving systematic selection and interpretive mediation creates opportunities for more reflective and inclusive archival practices that acknowledge their own limitations and exclusions. This recognition enables institutional practices that remain open to alternative perspectives and previously excluded materials rather than presenting current archival arrangements as natural or inevitable. The analysis suggests that responsible archival practice requires ongoing critical reflection on archival processes rather than theoretical frameworks that obscure selective decisions through claims to objective cultural value. The concept's analytical precision emerges through examination of how digital technologies transform archival processes while reproducing structural relationships between preservation and destruction. Digital archives appear to overcome traditional limitations of physical preservation by creating perfect copies that can be reproduced indefinitely without degradation. However, digital preservation depends on technological infrastructures, software compatibility, and institutional maintenance that introduce new forms of archival fragility and systematic vulnerability. Digital archives reveal how technological sophistication creates new dependencies rather than achieving archival self-sufficiency that eliminates temporal vulnerability. The analysis of digital archiving illuminates broader relationships between memory, technology, and temporal experience that operate across biological, cultural, and computational domains. Each domain operates through specific technical processes that enable temporal preservation while introducing domain-specific vulnerabilities and systematic limitations. These technical processes reveal what Derrida terms general technicity, that operates as structural condition for temporal relationship rather than external addition to natural temporal flow. The analysis suggests that technological development reveals rather than creates the technical conditions that enable temporal experience while preventing perfect temporal synthesis. However, the generalization of technicity across biological, cultural, and computational domains encounters objections regarding conceptual precision and explanatory power. Critics argue that treating biological memory, cultural transmission, and digital processing as instances of general technicity eliminates important distinctions between different types of processes and relationships. This objection suggests that Derrida's analysis provides abstract theoretical framework that cannot illuminate specific characteristics of particular archival processes. The objection challenges whether general technicity provides analytical resources for understanding concrete archival practices rather than imposing theoretical uniformity that obscures empirical differences. Derrida addresses this challenge by emphasizing how general technicity operates through what he terms differential specification that maintains structural insights while enabling domain-specific analysis. The concept provides analytical framework for examining how different archival processes maintain temporal relationships through technical mediation while operating through domain-specific mechanisms and institutional arrangements. This approach enables analysis of relationships between biological, cultural, and technological archives that traditional disciplinary boundaries obscure, while maintaining attention to specific characteristics that distinguish different archival processes. The analysis suggests that conceptual precision emerges through examination of how general structures operate through particular specifications rather than through abstract generalization that eliminates important empirical differences. Part 9. Justice and Law. The Undecidable and Decision. The relationship between justice and law reveals how legal systems depend on decisions that cannot be determined by legal rules alone, creating structural relationship between calculable legal procedures and incalculable ethical responsibility. Derrida's analysis shows how justice operates as impossible condition that both enables and exceeds legal determination, requiring decisions that must be made without sufficient grounds for calculation. This impossibility is not contingent limitation that improved legal theory could overcome, but structural condition that enables legal systems to respond to unprecedented situations while maintaining systematic consistency. The analysis reveals how legal decision-making operates through what cannot be reduced to mechanical rule application or arbitrary subjective choice, requiring forms of responsibility that exceed both legal determinacy and lawless decisionism. The logical structure of this relationship emerges through analysis of what must be true for legal systems to function as more than mechanical rule application. Legal rules achieve determinacy through their capacity for application across different cases and contexts, but no rule can determine its own application to novel situations that exceed its previous implementations. This indeterminacy creates space for judicial interpretation that must determine which aspects of new cases are legally relevant and which existing rules provide appropriate analogical resources. Legal decision-making requires interpretive judgment that operates through attention both to legal precedent and to singular aspects of current cases that may require innovative legal reasoning. Derrida's analysis reveals how this interpretive requirement creates aporia, a logical impossibility that must nevertheless be traversed through decision. Legal decisions must be both determined by legal rules to maintain systematic consistency and undetermined by legal rules to respond appropriately to singular cases that exceed previous legal experience. This double requirement cannot be satisfied simultaneously through logical calculation, creating structural undecidability that requires decision without sufficient grounds for determinacy. The aporia reveals how legal responsibility operates through what Derrida terms experience of the impossible, that both enables and exceeds legal determination. Consider how constitutional interpretation operates through this aporetic structure in cases that involve conflicts between established constitutional principles. Constitutional decisions must maintain fidelity to constitutional text and precedent while responding to contemporary situations that the constitutional framers could not have anticipated. This requirement creates interpretive challenges that cannot be resolved through mechanical rule application because constitutional principles themselves may conflict in unprecedented situations. Constitutional interpretation requires judicial decisions that determine how constitutional principles apply to novel circumstances while maintaining constitutional continuity across historical change. The analysis reveals how constitutional interpretation operates through what Derrida terms iterative fidelity, that combines respect for constitutional tradition with creative response to unprecedented constitutional challenges. Successful constitutional interpretation demonstrates continuity with established constitutional meaning while introducing interpretive innovations that address contemporary constitutional problems. This iterative process requires judicial responsibility that exceeds both strict constructionist adherence to original meaning and unconstrained judicial activism that ignores constitutional text. Constitutional interpretation reveals how legal decision-making operates through complex temporal relationships between inherited legal resources and unprecedented legal challenges that cannot be resolved through appeal to determinate methodological rules. However, this analysis of legal undecidability encounters objections regarding its implications for legal determinacy and democratic legitimacy. Critics argue that emphasis on judicial decision-making that exceeds legal determination undermines democratic accountability by treating legal interpretation as creative activity that exceeds popular democratic control. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of legal interpretation provides theoretical justification for judicial activism that violates democratic separation of powers by enabling courts to create law rather than applying democratically enacted legislation. The objection gains force by noting how legal undecidability appears to eliminate constraints on judicial interpretation that democratic legal systems require for legitimate institutional operation. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how democratic legitimacy itself depends on interpretive decisions that cannot be determined by democratic procedures alone. Democratic systems must determine who counts as legitimate democratic participant, which issues can be resolved through democratic procedures, and how democratic principles apply to unprecedented political situations. These determinations cannot be made through democratic voting because they establish the conditions within which democratic voting becomes possible and meaningful. Democratic legitimacy requires founding decisions that both enable and exceed democratic determination, revealing how democratic systems depend on interpretive responsibilities that cannot be reduced to procedural calculation. The analysis extends to examine how international law operates through similar aporiatic structures when addressing conflicts between national sovereignty and universal human rights principles. International legal systems must respect national sovereignty while maintaining universal principles that may require intervention in domestic affairs to protect human rights. This requirement creates legal challenges that cannot be resolved through appeal to established legal precedent, because they involve unprecedented situations where established principles conflict. International legal decision-making requires interpretive judgment that determines how universal principles apply to particular cultural and historical contexts while maintaining systematic consistency across different legal jurisdictions. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of specific cases where international legal systems encounter structural limits of legal determination. Crimes against humanity require legal prosecution that transcends national legal jurisdictions while respecting cultural differences in legal traditions and institutional arrangements. International criminal law must establish universal legal principles while implementing them through particular legal procedures that reflect historical and cultural specificities. This implementation requires legal decisions that cannot be determined by universal principles alone because such principles must be interpreted through particular legal contexts that exceed universal determination. Derrida's analysis reveals how these legal aporias illuminate broader relationships between ethical responsibility and institutional decision-making that operate across political, economic, and cultural domains. Institutional decisions must respond to systematic requirements for consistent policy implementation while remaining responsive to singular situations that exceed systematic anticipation. This double requirement creates structural undecidability that institutional actors must traverse through decisions that cannot be reduced to rule application or arbitrary choice. The analysis suggests that institutional responsibility operates most effectively when it acknowledges, rather than denies the undecidable elements that enable institutional adaptation, while requiring institutional decision-making that exceeds systematic determination. However, the extension of aporetic analysis beyond legal contexts encounters objections regarding its practical utility and political implications. Critics argue that emphasis on undecidability and impossible decision-making provides inadequate resources for practical institutional reform and political action. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis leads to political paralysis by revealing complexity that prevents rather than enables effective political engagement with systematic injustice and institutional failure. The objection challenges whether Derrida's analysis provides resources for constructive political criticism rather than sophisticated theoretical framework that obscures practical political possibilities. Derrida addresses this challenge through analysis of how recognition of undecidable structure enables rather than prevents responsible political engagement. Understanding institutional decisions as operating through structural undecidability creates opportunities for political criticism that reveals contingency of apparently natural institutional arrangements. This recognition enables political practices that remain open to alternative possibilities rather than treating current institutional arrangements as inevitable outcomes of systematic development. The analysis suggests that effective political action requires strategic engagement with undecidable elements within institutional processes, rather than theoretical frameworks that obscure institutional complexity through claims to systematic political knowledge that eliminates need for ongoing political responsibility. Part 10. Hospitality: The ethics of the unconditional welcome. Hospitality operates through a fundamental aporia that reveals the impossible condition of ethical relationship with the other. Unconditional hospitality demands absolute welcome of the other without conditions, questions, or requirements that would subordinate the other to the host's existing frameworks and expectations. However, any actual hospitality must establish conditions, boundaries, and procedures that enable hospitable relationship while necessarily limiting the unconditional welcome that defines hospitality as ethical relationship. This aporetic structure creates what Derrida terms hospitality, a structural relationship between hospitality and hostility that cannot be resolved through better hospitable practices, but reveals the impossible condition that enables ethical relationship with otherness. The logical precision of this aporia emerges through analysis of what must be true for hospitable relationship to operate as ethical encounter rather than assimilative appropriation. Ethical hospitality requires welcoming the other as other, rather than reducing otherness to familiar categories that eliminate genuine encounter with alterity. This requirement demands suspension of cognitive, practical, and evaluative frameworks that would determine the other's identity, intentions, and value according to the host's existing criteria. Unconditional hospitality must welcome the other without knowing who arrives, what they want, or whether their arrival threatens the host's security and self-understanding. However, this unconditional requirement encounters practical impossibilities that reveal internal tensions within hospitable relationship. Any actual welcome must occur through specific linguistic, cultural, and institutional frameworks that necessarily shape how otherness can appear and be recognized. The host's language, customs, and social arrangements provide conditions within which hospitable encounter becomes possible, while simultaneously limiting how otherness can manifest and be received. These limiting conditions appear to violate unconditional hospitality while actually providing necessary conditions through which hospitable relationship can emerge as concrete ethical encounter. Consider how immigration policies attempt to balance hospitable welcome with national security requirements and cultural integration concerns. Democratic societies committed to humanitarian principles must welcome refugees and asylum seekers while maintaining legal procedures that determine eligibility and integration requirements. These procedures require documentation, background investigation and cultural assessment that necessarily violate unconditional welcome while providing institutional framework within which hospitable relationship becomes politically possible. Immigration policies reveal how political hospitality operates through structural tension between ethical demand for unconditional welcome and political necessity for conditional institutional procedures. Derrida's analysis reveals how this tension illuminates broader relationships between ethics and politics that cannot be resolved through improved policy coordination. Political institutions must operate through general rules and systematic procedures that enable consistent policy implementation, while ethical relationship requires attention to singular others who exceed systematic anticipation. This structural difference creates ongoing tension between ethical responsibility and political effectiveness that political theory cannot eliminate through better institutional design. The tension reveals how political institutions both enable and limit ethical relationship in ways that require ongoing negotiation rather than systematic resolution. The analysis extends to examine how interpersonal relationships operate through similar hospitable structures that both welcome and constrain otherness. Friendship requires openness to the friend's alterity, while establishing shared frameworks of communication, mutual expectation, and reciprocal responsibility that shape how alterity can appear and be sustained. Close relationships demonstrate greatest intimacy through capacity for surprise, unexpected revelation, and ongoing discovery of previously unknown aspects of familiar others. This intimate unknowing reveals how interpersonal hospitality operates through structural relationship between familiarity and alterity that prevents complete knowledge while enabling ongoing relationship. However, the analysis of interpersonal hospitality encounters objections regarding its implications for relationship stability and mutual responsibility. Critics argue that emphasis on unlimited openness to alterity undermines capacity for sustained commitment and reciprocal obligation that relationships require for long-term stability and mutual flourishing. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of hospitality leads to relational instability that prevents rather than enhances ethical relationship. The objection gains force by noting how unlimited openness appears to eliminate boundaries and commitments that enable rather than threaten genuine interpersonal relationship. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how sustainable relationships depend on capacity for ongoing hospitality toward alterity within familiar others rather than elimination of otherness through complete mutual knowledge. Relationships achieve depth and longevity through continued capacity for surprise, growth, and mutual discovery that requires maintaining openness to aspects of familiar others that exceed current understanding. This ongoing hospitality enables rather than threatens relationship stability by preventing relationships from closing around fixed identities that eliminate possibility for mutual development and adaptive response to changing circumstances. The analysis suggests that relationship commitment operates most effectively when it includes commitment to ongoing openness toward alterity within familiar relationship, rather than commitment to fixed relational arrangements that exclude unexpected development. The argument's force emerges through analysis of how cultural hospitality operates through institutional practices that both preserve and transform cultural identity through encounter with cultural otherness. Multicultural societies must maintain cultural diversity while establishing common frameworks for intercultural communication and cooperation that enable diverse cultural communities to coexist productively. These frameworks require translation between different cultural languages and practices that necessarily alter what they translate, while enabling intercultural understanding and mutual recognition. Cultural hospitality reveals how cultural identity emerges through, rather than despite, intercultural encounter, suggesting that cultural preservation requires ongoing cultural transformation through hospitable relationship with cultural otherness. The analysis illuminates how linguistic hospitality operates through translation practices that both enable and limit intercultural communication. Translation requires interpretive decisions that determine how concepts, values, and practices from one cultural context can be rendered comprehensible within different cultural frameworks. These interpretive decisions necessarily alter what they translate by adapting foreign concepts to domestic linguistic and cultural resources, while creating new linguistic possibilities that exceed existing cultural boundaries. Translation reveals how linguistic hospitality operates through creative interpretation that maintains fidelity to foreign meaning while enabling domestic understanding through innovative linguistic development. However, the analysis of cultural and linguistic hospitality encounters objections regarding cultural identity and community coherence. Critics argue that unlimited cultural openness leads to cultural fragmentation that eliminates shared frameworks necessary for community solidarity and collective political action. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of hospitality undermines rather than enhances multicultural democracy by eliminating cultural boundaries that enable rather than threaten intercultural cooperation. The objection challenges whether hospitable openness provides resources for maintaining cultural communities capable of effective political engagement, rather than dissolving communities into individualistic cultural consumption that eliminates possibility for collective political agency. Derrida addresses this challenge through analysis of how community identity emerges through, rather than despite, hospitable encounter with community otherness. Vibrant communities maintain identity through capacity for internal diversity, innovative adaptation, and creative response to external challenges rather than through elimination of internal difference and external relationship. This adaptive capacity requires what Derrida terms autoimmunitory process that enables community protection through controlled exposure to otherness that both threatens and revitalizes community identity. The analysis suggests that effective community solidarity requires strategic engagement with hospitable possibilities, rather than community closure that eliminates exposure to otherness, while also eliminating community capacity for creative adaptation and democratic development. Part 11. The Gift and Economy Beyond Exchange Logic. The gift reveals impossible logic that both enables and exceeds economic calculation by requiring generosity that cannot be reduced to strategic exchange or reciprocal obligation. Authentic gift-giving must operate without expectation of return, recognition, or gratitude that would transform generous giving into disguised economic transaction. However, any actual gift occurs within social relationships that necessarily create obligations, expectations, and reciprocal dynamics that appear to eliminate gifts' generous character while providing social conditions within which generous giving becomes possible. This impossible structure reveals how economic and ethical relationships operate through systematic exclusion of generous possibilities that both threaten and enable economic calculation. Derrida's analysis of gift logic emerges through critical engagement with anthropological studies of gift exchange that attempt to reduce generous giving to economic calculation through analysis of reciprocal obligations and strategic social benefits. Marcel Mauss's influential analysis treats gift-giving as fundamental economic institution that creates social bonds through systematic reciprocal exchange disguised as generous giving. This reduction enables scientific analysis of gift-giving practices while eliminating precisely what distinguishes generous giving from economic transaction: the absence of calculation that makes giving genuinely generous rather than strategically motivated. Derrida's analysis reveals how anthropological reduction of gift to exchange obscures rather than illuminates the generous possibilities that both enable and exceed economic relationships. The logical structure of genuine gift-giving requires what Derrida terms triple effacement, that eliminates the conscious recognition that would transform generous giving into calculated exchange. The giver must not recognize their giving as gift that creates obligation or expectation of reciprocal return. The receiver must not recognize receiving as creating debt or obligation that requires repayment through reciprocal giving. The gift itself must not appear as gift that creates relationship of obligation between giver and receiver. This triple effacement creates logical paradox. The gift must occur without being recognized as gift by any participant in the generous exchange. Recognition of gift as gift appears to eliminate generous character by introducing calculation into supposedly non-calculating generous relationship. However, complete elimination of recognition would also eliminate gift, because giving without any form of recognition could not be distinguished from accidental loss or unconscious behavior. The paradox reveals structural impossibility that both enables and prevents genuine generous giving within social relationships that necessarily involve recognition, memory, and reciprocal expectation. Consider how forgiveness operates through similar impossible logic that both requires and excludes recognition of generous character. Authentic forgiveness must be freely given without calculation of benefit, expectation of changed behavior, or demand for reciprocal acknowledgement that would transform forgiveness into conditional transaction. However, forgiveness without recognition of injury, acknowledgement of generous character, or expectation of reconciliation appears to eliminate precisely what makes forgiveness ethically significant rather than mere forgetting or indifference. Forgiveness reveals how generous relationship operates through structural tension between generous giving and social recognition that cannot be resolved through improved generous practice. The analysis extends to examine how creative activity operates through gift logic that both enables and exceeds economic calculation of artistic production and cultural value. Artistic creation requires generous giving of creative energy and cultural resources that cannot be reduced to strategic calculation of economic return or social recognition. However, artistic production occurs within cultural and economic institutions that necessarily involve market calculation, social recognition, and reciprocal cultural obligation that appear to eliminate generous character of creative activity. Artistic creation reveals how cultural creativity operates through structural relationship between generous giving and economic calculation that enables cultural production while preventing its reduction to economic transaction. However, this analysis of gift logic encounters objections regarding its relationship to social justice and economic equality. Critics argue that emphasis on generous giving that exceeds reciprocal obligation obscures systematic economic inequality and exploitative social relationships that require political correction rather than generous individual response. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of gift provides ideological justification for economic systems that depend on generous giving to supplement systematic social injustice. The objection gains force by noting how appeal to generous giving can obscure political responsibility for creating just economic institutions that eliminate need for charitable supplementation of systematic economic inequality. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how social justice itself depends on generous possibilities that both enable and exceed systematic political calculation. Just institutions require founding decisions that establish principles of justice through generous commitment that cannot be derived from prior social agreement or calculated benefit. These founding decisions create social frameworks within which reciprocal obligation and systematic justice become possible, while necessarily exceeding systematic justification. The analysis suggests that sustainable just institutions require ongoing generous commitment that maintains openness to excluded others and unrecognized injustices, rather than systematic closure around established principles of distributive justice. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of how democratic institutions depend on citizen participation that cannot be reduced to strategic calculation of individual benefit. Democratic legitimacy requires citizen engagement that operates through generous commitment to public good, rather than purely strategic pursuit of individual or group interest. This generous dimension enables democratic institutions to address collective problems that exceed individual capacity, while creating social bonds that cannot be maintained through strategic calculation alone. Democratic participation reveals how political institutions depend on generous possibilities that both enable and exceed institutional capacity for systematic political calculation and procedural democratic legitimacy. The analysis illuminates how intellectual activity operates through generous sharing of knowledge and ideas that cannot be reduced to academic competition or professional advancement. Scholarly research requires generous engagement with previous intellectual work and open sharing of discoveries that enables collective intellectual development while exceeding individual strategic benefit. Academic institutions depend on generous intellectual collaboration while necessarily involving competitive evaluation and professional recognition that appear to eliminate generous character of intellectual activity. Intellectual work reveals how knowledge production operates through structural relationship between generous intellectual sharing and institutional academic competition that enables scholarly development while preventing its reduction to strategic professional activity. However, the extension of gift logic to intellectual and political domains encounters objections regarding its practical implications and institutional utility. Critics argue that emphasis on generous giving that exceeds systematic calculation provides inadequate resources for institutional reform and political organization that require sustained strategic planning and coordinated collective action. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of gift leads to political ineffectiveness by encouraging individual generous response rather than systematic institutional change. The objection challenges whether gift logic provides analytical resources for understanding institutional processes rather than romantic individual ethics that obscures structural political problems requiring systematic political solutions. Derrida addresses this challenge by emphasizing how effective institutional reform depends on capacity for generous institutional innovation that exceeds systematic calculation of institutional benefit and strategic political advantage. Successful institutional change requires political imagination and innovative policy development that operates through generous commitment to excluded others and unrecognized possibilities, rather than purely strategic calculation of political feasibility. This generous dimension enables rather than prevents effective political action by maintaining institutional openness to alternative possibilities and unprecedented political developments. The analysis suggests that strategic political effectiveness requires generous possibilities that maintain political responsiveness to systematic exclusions and emerging political challenges, rather than institutional closure around established political calculations and systematic strategic planning. Part 12. Democracy and the Political, the Democracy to Come. Democracy operates through fundamental aporiatic structure that reveals the impossibility and necessity of democratic self-determination. Democratic legitimacy requires popular sovereignty that establishes political authority through collective self-legislation. Yet no democratic community can determine its own foundational conditions without presupposing the political unity that democratic procedures are supposed to create. This circular dependency creates what Derrida terms autoimmune logic, where democratic systems must protect themselves against their own democratic possibilities to maintain systematic democratic functioning. The analysis reveals how democratic institutions operate through structural exclusions that both enable and threaten democratic ideals while requiring ongoing democratic negotiation that cannot be resolved through improved democratic procedures. The logical structure of democratic autoimmunity emerges through analysis of how democratic systems must establish boundaries around democratic participation to enable effective democratic decision-making. Democratic procedures require determining who counts as legitimate democratic participant, which issues can be resolved through democratic voting, and how democratic principles apply to unprecedented political situations. These determinations cannot be made through democratic procedures alone because they establish the conditions within which democratic voting becomes possible and meaningful. Democratic founding requires decisions that both enable and exceed democratic determination, revealing how democratic legitimacy depends on non-democratic elements that democratic theory cannot fully acknowledge without threatening systematic democratic consistency. Derrida's concept of democracy to come operates through temporal structure that maintains democratic possibility while preventing democratic completion in present institutional arrangements. This temporal structure does not refer to future democratic achievement that will resolve current democratic limitations through improved democratic institutions and procedures. Instead, democracy to come describes structural openness within democratic systems that prevents systematic closure while enabling ongoing democratic responsiveness to excluded others and unprecedented political challenges. The concept reveals how democratic possibility requires maintaining tension between institutional democratic functioning and democratic ideals that exceed institutional realization without eliminating need for concrete democratic institutional practices. Consider how constitutional democracy attempts to resolve democratic autoimmunity through constitutional constraints on democratic decision-making that protect minority rights and fundamental democratic principles. Constitutional frameworks establish legal limits on majority power while maintaining democratic legitimacy through processes of constitutional amendment and judicial interpretation that enable constitutional adaptation over time. However, constitutional constraint necessarily limits democratic self-determination by subjecting democratic decisions to legal review that operates through non-democratic judicial authority. Constitutional democracy reveals structural tension between democratic autonomy and legal constraint that cannot be resolved through better constitutional design, but requires ongoing negotiation between democratic and legal authority that exceeds systematic constitutional determination. The analysis extends to examine how democratic inclusion operates through processes that necessarily create new forms of democratic exclusion while expanding democratic participation. Democratic systems achieve greater inclusivity by extending voting rights, political representation, and legal protection to previously excluded groups, while necessarily maintaining boundaries that distinguish legitimate democratic participants from those who remain outside democratic community. These boundaries require ongoing democratic negotiation that determines how democratic principles apply to immigration, citizenship, and political membership in ways that cannot be determined by existing democratic procedures alone. Democratic inclusion reveals how democratic expansion depends on decisions about democratic boundaries that both extend and limit democratic community through processes that exceed systematic democratic calculation. However, the analysis of democratic autoimmunity encounters objections regarding its implications for democratic theory and practical democratic reform. Critics argue that emphasis on structural democratic impossibility undermines theoretical resources for democratic improvement and political criticism of inadequate democratic institutions and practices. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis leads to democratic paralysis by revealing complexity that prevents rather than enables constructive democratic engagement with systematic democratic failures. The objection gains force by noting how emphasis on democratic aporia appears to eliminate normative standards for evaluating democratic institutions and political practices through appeal to democratic ideals that transcend current democratic arrangements. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how recognition of democratic complexity enables rather than prevents responsible democratic engagement and institutional criticism. Understanding democratic systems as operating through structural tensions and aporetic relationships creates opportunities for democratic criticism that reveals contingency of apparently natural democratic arrangements while maintaining commitment to democratic possibility. This recognition enables democratic practices that remain responsive to excluded others and unprecedented political challenges, rather than closing around established democratic procedures and institutional arrangements. The analysis suggests that effective democratic criticism requires engagement with democratic complexity rather than appeal to simplified democratic ideals that obscure structural democratic tensions and institutional democratic limitations. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of how democratic hospitality operates in contemporary political contexts that involve cultural diversity, immigration, and global interdependence. Multicultural democracy must balance respect for cultural difference with common democratic frameworks that enable intercultural cooperation and mutual recognition. This balance requires ongoing negotiation between cultural autonomy and democratic integration that cannot be resolved through fixed multicultural policies, but requires adaptive democratic practices that respond to changing cultural and political circumstances. Multicultural democracy reveals how democratic inclusion operates through creative institutional innovation rather than mechanical application of established democratic principles to unprecedented cultural and political situations. The analysis illuminates how global democracy encounters structural limitations that reveal broader relationships between democratic legitimacy and territorial sovereignty. Democratic institutions developed within territorial nation-states, while contemporary political challenges increasingly exceed national boundaries through global economic, environmental, and cultural interdependence. Global democratic governance requires institutional innovation that maintains democratic accountability while operating across cultural and political differences that exceed national democratic traditions. Global democracy reveals how democratic possibility requires institutional experimentation that exceeds current democratic theory while remaining committed to democratic values that cannot be systematically defined or institutionally guaranteed. However, the extension of democratic analysis to global political contexts encounters objections regarding cultural imperialism and political feasibility. Critics argue that emphasis on global democratic possibility imposes Western political concepts and institutional arrangements on cultural contexts that require different forms of political organization and collective decision-making. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of democracy reproduces rather than challenges cultural hierarchies by treating Western democratic concepts as universal political ideals. The objection challenges whether democratic analysis provides resources for intercultural political cooperation rather than theoretical framework that obscures cultural differences through appeal to supposedly universal democratic values that actually reflect particular cultural and historical traditions. Derrida addresses this challenge through analysis of how democratic possibility operates through cultural translation that both maintains democratic commitment and enables cultural adaptation without eliminating important cultural differences. Democratic values achieve intercultural significance through translation processes that adapt democratic concepts to different cultural contexts, while creating new political possibilities that exceed both original democratic traditions and receiving cultural frameworks. This translational process requires political experimentation rather than mechanical application of established democratic models to different cultural and political contexts. The analysis suggests that democratic possibility requires ongoing cultural and political translation that maintains commitment to inclusive political participation while enabling creative political innovation that exceeds systematic democratic theory and established democratic institutional arrangements. Part 13. Death and Finitude-Temporality and the Limit. Death operates as the absolute limit that both enables and terminates meaningful temporal experience, revealing how human finitude creates the temporal urgency that makes ethical relationship and political commitment possible while preventing their completion in systematic knowledge or institutional permanence. Unlike other temporal limits that can be exceeded through extension or overcome through technological innovation, death represents structural finitude that cannot be eliminated without eliminating the temporal conditions that enable meaningful human experience. Derrida's analysis reveals how death operates as possibility of impossibility that enables authentic temporal relationship while preventing temporal experience from achieving complete self-presence or systematic closure. This analysis challenges traditional philosophical attempts to overcome death through theoretical knowledge or spiritual transcendence by showing how meaningful life depends on, rather than despite finite temporal relationship with mortality. The logical structure of mortal temporality emerges through analysis of how consciousness of death affects present experience and future planning. Awareness of mortality creates temporal urgency that enables present experience to achieve intensity and significance, while preventing present experience from achieving complete self-sufficiency or temporal independence. This mortal consciousness operates through what Derrida terms being toward death, that maintains temporal relationship with absolute future that cannot be anticipated, controlled, or experienced. Death reveals temporal structure where future absolute limit affects present experience without becoming present experience, creating temporal relationship that operates through structural relationship between presence and absence rather than temporal succession of present moments. However, this analysis of mortal temporality encounters sophisticated philosophical objections that emerge from Epicurean arguments about death's relationship to experience. If death represents absolute cessation of experience, then death cannot be experienced as evil or limitation, because experience and death are mutually exclusive by definition. This argument suggests that fear of death represents conceptual confusion that can be eliminated through philosophical reflection that recognizes death's experiential irrelevance. The Epicurean position challenges whether mortality affects meaningful experience or represents external limit that philosophical wisdom can overcome through proper understanding of death's relationship to conscious experience. Derrida's analysis reveals how this Epicurean argument depends on temporal assumptions that cannot account for how consciousness of mortality affects present experience and interpersonal relationship. Human temporal experience operates through temporal synthesis that includes retentional relationship with past experience and pretensional anticipation of future possibilities, including ultimate death. This temporal synthesis means that consciousness of mortality affects present experience not as anticipation of future experiential state, but as structural condition that shapes present temporal relationships and interpersonal commitments. Mortal consciousness creates what Derrida terms survivance, that operates through temporal relationship between living experience and death that cannot be reduced to either present experience or future cessation of experience. The analysis extends to examine how mourning reveals temporal structures that challenge traditional philosophical distinctions between presence and absence, life and death. Mourning involves ongoing relationship with dead others who are no longer present but continue to affect present experience through memory, inherited cultural traditions, and unfinished interpersonal projects. This ongoing relationship cannot be reduced to psychological process that gradually eliminates attachment to absent others, because mourning involves ethical obligations to dead others that exceed temporal limitations of living experience. Mourning reveals how interpersonal relationship operates through temporal structures that exceed biological life, while depending on living memory and cultural transmission for their continuation across temporal duration. Consider how responsibility to dead others creates ethical obligations that cannot be fulfilled within individual lifetime, yet must be maintained through living commitment and cultural transmission. Historical injustices create ethical debts to victims who cannot be directly compensated, while requiring ongoing political commitment to preventing repetition and acknowledging historical responsibility. This responsibility operates through what Derrida terms hauntology, that maintains relationship with past others through present commitment that exceeds individual capacity for ethical fulfillment. Historical responsibility reveals how ethical relationship requires temporal commitment that exceeds individual mortality while depending on individual ethical decision and political action for its social realization. The concept of hauntology extends to analyze how cultural inheritance operates through relationship with cultural traditions that both enable and exceed present cultural activity. Cultural creativity requires engagement with inherited cultural resources that provide materials and frameworks for innovative cultural development, while necessarily involving transformation that alters inherited cultural traditions. This cultural relationship operates through temporal structure, where past cultural achievement affects present cultural possibility without determining present cultural development, creating cultural continuity through cultural innovation rather than identical cultural repetition. Cultural inheritance reveals how meaningful cultural activity requires temporal relationship with cultural others who are no longer present, but continue to affect cultural possibility through ongoing cultural interpretation and creative cultural adaptation. However, the analysis of hauntological temporality encounters objections regarding its implications for individual autonomy and rational decision-making. Critics argue that emphasis on ongoing relationship with absent others undermines capacity for independent judgment and autonomous action that rational agents require for ethical and political responsibility. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of temporal relationship leads to heteronomy that eliminates rather than enhances individual capacity for rational choice and ethical commitment. The objection gains force by noting how hauntological analysis appears to treat individual consciousness as effect of temporal relationships that exceed conscious control rather than as autonomous source of meaningful action and ethical decision. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how autonomous decision-making itself depends on temporal relationships and cultural inheritance that exceed individual consciousness while enabling rather than eliminating individual responsibility. Rational decision-making requires linguistic competence, cultural knowledge, and ethical frameworks that are inherited from cultural traditions rather than created through individual consciousness alone. These inherited resources provide materials for individual ethical reflection and political decision while requiring individual interpretive activity that adapts inherited resources to unprecedented ethical and political situations. Individual autonomy emerges through, rather than despite, cultural inheritance and temporal relationship, suggesting that responsible individual decision-making requires acknowledgement of its temporal and cultural conditions rather than abstract individual self-sufficiency that eliminates cultural and temporal relationship. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of how technological reproduction affects mortal temporality by creating technical survival that exceeds biological mortality while remaining subject to technical destruction and systematic obsolescence. Digital archives enable cultural transmission that transcends individual biological mortality while introducing new forms of technical fragility and institutional dependency. Technological survival reveals how contemporary temporal experience operates through technical mediations that both extend and alter traditional relationships between individual mortality and cultural inheritance. Technical reproduction creates what Derrida terms spectrality that operates through structural relationship between living experience and technical survival that cannot be reduced to either biological life or mechanical technical process. The analysis illuminates broader relationships between individual mortality and species survival that operate through evolutionary processes and environmental interdependence. Individual biological death enables species adaptation through genetic variation and environmental selection, while species survival depends on individual biological reproduction and environmental stewardship that exceed individual biological interest. This relationship reveals temporal structures that operate across different temporal scales and biological levels in ways that challenge traditional philosophical emphasis on individual consciousness and rational autonomy. Evolutionary temporality suggests how individual meaningful experience operates within biological and environmental contexts that both enable and exceed individual temporal experience while requiring individual biological and cultural activity for their continuation and adaptive development. Part 14. The animal question beyond the human-animal opposition. The traditional philosophical opposition between human and animal depends on systematic exclusion of animality from human essence, while actual human-animal relationships reveal complex interdependencies and shared characteristics that exceed this foundational distinction. Western philosophy constructs human exceptionality through claims to rational language, ethical responsibility, and political organization that supposedly distinguish humans absolutely from animal existence, defined by instinctual behavior and natural necessity. Derrida's analysis reveals how this absolute distinction operates through systematic violence that both enables human identity formation and obscures the animal characteristics that continue to operate within human experience and social organization. The critique does not eliminate differences between humans and other animals, but examines how these differences operate through complex relationships rather than absolute metaphysical oppositions that justify systematic animal subordination and exploitation. The logical structure of human exceptionality operates through what Derrida terms carnophalangocentric framework that combines masculine privilege, rational discourse, and meat-eating practices into systematic ideological structure. This framework treats rational speech as essentially human capacity that enables ethical relationship, political organization, and cultural development while reducing animal existence to purely biological processes that lack ethical significance. Carnophalangocentrism enables human identity formation through systematic exclusion of animal characteristics, while depending on animal exploitation for biological survival and cultural development. The framework creates systematic blindness to animal suffering and environmental destruction, while presenting human rational capacity as natural justification for human dominance over animal and natural existence. However, Derrida's analysis does not simply reverse this hierarchy by privileging animal existence over human rational capacity, which would reproduce the metaphysical structure while changing its content. Instead, the analysis examines how human-animal relationships operate through complex interdependencies that reveal the inadequacy of absolute distinctions for understanding actual biological and cultural relationships. This examination requires attention to specific differences between different animal species and different forms of human-animal relationship, rather than general claims about animal or human essence. The approach emphasizes what Derrida terms animote, a neologism that combines animal and mot word, to indicate how human-animal relationships operate through linguistic and conceptual mediations that affect both human and animal existence. Consider how contemporary scientific research reveals cognitive and emotional capacities in various animal species that challenge traditional philosophical claims about human rational exceptionality. Studies of primate communication, elephant mourning behavior, and cetacean cultural transmission demonstrate forms of symbolic communication, emotional complexity, and cultural learning that were traditionally considered exclusively human capacities. These discoveries do not prove that animals possess identical cognitive capacities to humans, but reveal complex continuities and differences that cannot be captured through absolute human-animal opposition. Scientific research suggests that cognitive and emotional capacities operate across species boundaries through evolutionary relationships rather than absolute metaphysical distinctions between rational and instinctual existence. The analysis extends to examine how human linguistic capacity itself depends on embodied and instinctual processes that connect rather than separate human communication from animal communication systems. Human language acquisition requires biological capacities for vocal production, auditory discrimination, and social learning that operate through genetic programming and environmental interaction similar to animal communication development. Linguistic meaning depends on gestural expression, emotional intonation, and spatial relationship that exceed rational propositional content while enabling meaningful human communication. human linguistic capacity emerges through rather than despite animal biological inheritance, suggesting that linguistic exceptionality operates through complex relationships with rather than absolute separation from animal communication systems. However, this analysis of human-animal continuity encounters objections regarding its implications for human ethical responsibility and political organization. Critics argue that emphasis on human-animal similarity undermines human capacity for ethical commitment and political justice by reducing human action to animal instinctual behavior. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of human-animal opposition eliminates rather than enhances human ethical capacity by treating ethical responsibility as illusion that obscures biological determinism. The objection gains force by noting how animal behavior appears to operate through instinctual programming that lacks the reflective capacity and autonomous choice that ethical responsibility requires. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how ethical responsibility emerges through, rather than despite, complex relationships between rational reflection and embodied animal inheritance. Ethical decision-making requires emotional responsiveness, empathetic recognition, and instinctual moral reaction that operate through biological capacities that humans share with other animal species. These animal capacities enable rather than prevent ethical relationship by providing biological foundation for interpersonal recognition and emotional commitment that purely rational calculation cannot generate. Ethical responsibility achieves its distinctively human character through cultural and linguistic elaboration of animal, emotional and social capacities, rather than through elimination of animal biological inheritance. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of how environmental ethics requires forms of interspecies relationship and ecological thinking that exceed traditional human-centered ethical frameworks. Environmental destruction and climate change create ethical challenges that cannot be addressed through ethical theories that focus exclusively on human rational agents and human political communities. Environmental ethics requires forms of ethical relationship with non-human animals, plant communities, and ecological systems that extend ethical concern beyond traditional boundaries of rational moral agency. This extension does not eliminate important differences between humans and other natural entities, but requires ethical frameworks that can address complex interdependencies between human cultural development and environmental sustainability. The analysis reveals how factory farming and industrial agriculture operate through systematic animal suffering that is enabled by philosophical frameworks that exclude animals from ethical consideration while depending on animal exploitation for economic efficiency and cultural practices. Industrial animal production involves systematic confinement, genetic manipulation, and slaughter processes that would be recognized as torture and murder if applied to humans, while being treated as acceptable economic practice when applied to animals. This systematic violence requires philosophical justification through claims about animal inability to suffer meaningfully or participate in ethical relationship. The analysis of industrial animal production reveals how carnophallogocentric ideology enables systematic violence through theoretical frameworks that obscure rather than acknowledge the ethical significance of animal suffering. However, the critique of animal exploitation encounters objections regarding cultural tradition, economic necessity, and practical political feasibility. Critics argue that elimination of animal exploitation would require fundamental changes in cultural practices, economic systems, and individual lifestyle choices that exceed practical political possibility. This objection suggests that deconstructive animal ethics provides impractical idealism that cannot address real cultural and economic constraints on individual and collective behavior. The objection challenges whether animal ethics provides resources for practical political reform rather than theoretical criticism that ignores cultural and economic realities that make animal exploitation appear necessary for human cultural development and economic survival. Derrida addresses this challenge by emphasizing how recognition of human-animal interdependence enables rather than prevents practical environmental and ethical reform through strategic political engagement with cultural and economic systems. Understanding human cultural development as dependent on environmental sustainability and interspecies relationship creates opportunities for political practices that address environmental destruction and animal exploitation through practical institutional reform. This recognition enables political coalition between environmental, animal rights and social justice movements rather than treating these concerns as competing political priorities. The analysis suggests that effective environmental politics requires recognition of complex interdependencies between human cultural development, animal welfare, and ecological sustainability, rather than appeal to abstract ethical principles that ignore practical political constraints and cultural resistance to environmental and ethical reform. Part 15. Specters and Hauntology. The logic of haunting. Hauntology describes temporal logic that operates through presence of absence, revealing how past events and future possibilities affect present experience without becoming present themselves. This spectral temporality challenges traditional ontology that privileges present existence while showing how meaningful experience depends on temporal relationships with what is no longer present and not yet actualized. Specters are neither present beings nor absent nothings, but operate through temporal structure that Derrida terms viability, the capacity to affect present experience while remaining structurally non-present. Hauntological analysis reveals how social, political and cultural life depends on spectral relationships that exceed traditional metaphysical categories while requiring new forms of temporal analysis that can account for non-present effectiveness. The logical precision of spectral effectiveness emerges through Derrida's analysis of Marx's theoretical encounter with capitalist social relationships that operate through systematic mystification and commodity fetishism. Marx's critique of political economy reveals how capitalist production creates social relationships between persons that appear as natural relationships between things, while actual social relationships become invisible through market mechanisms. This analysis demonstrates spectral logic where social relationships affect economic and political experience without appearing directly within economic and political institutions. Commodity fetishism operates through hauntological structure where human social relationships become spectral presences that affect market behavior while remaining systematically invisible to market participants and economic theorists. However, Derrida's analysis reveals how Marx's critique of spectral capitalism depends on theoretical framework that attempts to eliminate spectral relationships through scientific analysis that reveals actual social relationships hidden by capitalist mystification. Marxist theory seeks to overcome capitalist ideology through theoretical demystification that would enable rational social organization based on transparent social relationships rather than mystified commodity relationships. This theoretical approach reproduces traditional ontological privilege of presence by treating spectral relationships as temporary mystifications that scientific analysis can eliminate rather than structural conditions that operate within all social relationships. The critique suggests that effective analysis of capitalist social relationships requires acknowledgement of spectral temporality rather than theoretical frameworks that attempt to achieve non-spectral social transparency. Consider how historical trauma operates through hauntological structure that affects present cultural and political experience without being directly present within current social institutions. Historical events like slavery, genocide, and colonial exploitation create ongoing cultural and psychological effects that cannot be reduced to present social conditions or individual psychological states. These historical effects operate through what Derrida terms crypt, that maintains relationship with traumatic past through symptoms and cultural practices that repeat traumatic patterns without conscious recognition. Historical trauma reveals how past events continue to affect present experience through spectral presence that exceeds both historical consciousness and psychological analysis, while requiring forms of cultural and political response that acknowledge spectral temporality. The analysis extends to examine how cultural inheritance operates through spectral relationship with cultural traditions that both enable and exceed present cultural activity. Cultural creativity requires engagement with inherited cultural resources that provide frameworks and materials for innovative cultural development, while necessarily involving interpretation that alters inherited cultural meaning. This interpretive relationship operates through temporal structure, where past cultural achievement affects present cultural possibility without determining present cultural development. Cultural inheritance reveals spectral temporality, where cultural others who are no longer present continue to participate in present cultural activity through ongoing cultural interpretation and creative cultural adaptation that maintains cultural relationship across temporal distance. However, the analysis of spectral cultural inheritance encounters objections regarding its implications for cultural authenticity and individual creative autonomy. Critics argue that emphasis on ongoing relationship with cultural specters undermines capacity for authentic cultural innovation and individual creative expression that requires independence from cultural tradition and historical influence. This objection suggests that hauntological analysis reduces cultural creativity to repetition of inherited cultural patterns rather than genuine cultural innovation that transcends cultural inheritance. The objection challenges whether spectral analysis provides resources for understanding cultural creativity rather than theoretical framework that eliminates individual cultural agency through emphasis on cultural determination and historical influence that exceeds individual cultural control. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how cultural innovation emerges through creative interpretation of inherited cultural resources rather than through elimination of cultural inheritance and historical relationship. Original cultural creativity requires deep engagement with cultural tradition that enables innovative cultural response to contemporary cultural challenges and unprecedented cultural possibilities. This creative interpretation operates through what Derrida terms inventive faithfulness, that combines respect for inherited cultural meaning with adaptive response to contemporary cultural needs and emerging cultural possibilities. Cultural innovation achieves its most powerful effects through creative transformation of inherited cultural resources rather than abstract cultural innovation that eliminates relationship with cultural tradition and historical cultural development. The argument's force emerges through analysis of how technological development operates through spectral relationships between present technical capacity and future technical possibilities that cannot be anticipated or controlled. Technological innovation creates unintended consequences and unforeseen applications that exceed original technical intentions while affecting future technological development in ways that cannot be predicted through technical calculation. Technical development operates through temporal structure, where future technical possibilities affect present technical decision-making without becoming present technical realities. Technological development reveals spectral temporality, where technical futures haunt present technical practice through possibilities that both enable and threaten current technical arrangements while requiring technical decisions that cannot be determined through present technical knowledge. The analysis illuminates how contemporary media and information technologies create new forms of spectral presence that affect social and political experience through digital reproduction and virtual reality systems. Digital media enable forms of communication and cultural transmission that exceed traditional spatial and temporal limitations while creating new dependencies on technical infrastructure and institutional control. Virtual technologies create experiences of presence and interaction that operate through technical mediation rather than immediate physical relationship. Digital spectrality reveals how contemporary social relationships increasingly operate through technical mediations that both enable and alter traditional forms of interpersonal relationship and cultural community, while creating new possibilities for social and political organization that exceed current political theory. However, the analysis of technological spectrality encounters objections regarding its implications for authentic human relationship and democratic political participation. Critics argue that technical mediation of social relationships eliminates rather than enhances genuine interpersonal connection and collective political engagement by replacing authentic human community with artificial technical simulation. This objection suggests that hauntological analysis of digital technology provides theoretical justification for social arrangements that isolate individuals from meaningful community relationship and democratic political participation. The objection challenges whether spectral analysis provides resources for understanding beneficial uses of communication technology rather than theoretical framework that obscures harmful effects of technical mediation on human, social, and political development. Derrida addresses this challenge through analysis of how all forms of interpersonal relationship and political community depend on forms of technical mediation and spectral presence that exceed immediate physical relationship. Language, cultural tradition, and political institutions operate through technical systems of recording, transmission, and interpretation that enable rather than prevent meaningful interpersonal and political relationship. Contemporary digital technologies reveal rather than create the technical conditions that enable social relationship and political community, while introducing new possibilities and limitations that require careful analysis rather than wholesale rejection. The analysis suggests that effective evaluation of contemporary technical mediation requires understanding of how technical conditions both enable and constrain social and political possibility rather than nostalgic appeal to supposedly authentic human relationship that existed prior to technical mediation. Part 16. Religion without religion, the Messianic structure. The religious structure of experience operates prior to specific religious traditions while making religious traditions possible through what Derrida terms Messianicity without messianism, an opening toward absolute future that cannot be anticipated or controlled. This structural messianicity differs from particular messianic traditions that specify the content and timing of expected salvation or revolutionary transformation. Instead, Messianicity describes formal structure of temporal experience that remains open to unprecedented possibilities while preventing temporal experience from achieving complete self-presence or systematic closure. The analysis reveals how secular political and cultural institutions depend on messianic temporal structure while attempting to eliminate religious dimensions through scientific rationality and systematic institutional organization. The logical structure of messianicity emerges through analysis of temporal experience that includes essential relationship to absolute future that exceeds anticipation and calculation. Present experience achieves meaning through pretensional relationship toward future possibilities that cannot be determined by present knowledge or controlled through present action. This futural relationship operates through what Derrida terms absolute arrival that remains structurally unexpected, while affecting present temporal orientation and ethical commitment. Messianic temporality reveals how meaningful present experience depends on temporal openness that cannot be filled by present content or eliminated through improved present knowledge and technical control. However, this analysis of messianic structure encounters the objection that it eliminates important distinctions between religious and secular experience by treating all temporal experience as essentially religious in structure. Critics argue that universalizing messianic structure obscures significant differences between religious faith and rational secular analysis by reducing both to identical temporal structure. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of religion eliminates rather than illuminates religious experience by treating religious specificity as surface variation on universal temporal structure. The objection challenges whether messianic analysis provides resources for understanding particular religious traditions rather than abstract theoretical framework that eliminates religious difference through universal temporal generalization. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how messianic structure enables rather than eliminates religious specificity by providing formal conditions within which different religious traditions develop distinctive approaches to ultimate concerns and absolute future relationship. Particular religious traditions achieve their specific character through creative interpretation of messianic structure that generates distinctive religious practices, theological concepts, and institutional arrangements. These specific religious developments reveal different possibilities within messianic structure rather than surface variations on identical religious essence. The analysis suggests that understanding messianic structure enables rather than prevents appreciation of religious difference by revealing formal conditions that enable diverse religious creativity and theological innovation rather than reducing religious traditions to identical temporal structure. Consider how the Abrahamic religious traditions demonstrate different approaches to messianic temporal structure through distinctive concepts of divine revelation, prophetic authority, and eschatological expectation. Judaism maintains messianic expectation through ongoing interpretive engagement with traditional religious texts and practices without fixing messianic content or timing through systematic theological determination. Christianity treats messianic expectation as partially fulfilled through historical incarnation, while maintaining temporal openness toward final eschatological completion that exceeds historical realization. Islam emphasizes submission to divine revelation that has been definitively given, while requiring ongoing interpretive application to unprecedented historical and cultural circumstances. These different religious approaches reveal how messianic structure enables diverse religious creativity rather than identical religious content. Each religious tradition develops distinctive theological concepts, religious practices, and institutional arrangements that respond to messianic structure through particular cultural and historical resources. Religious difference emerges through creative religious response to messianic structure, rather than through elimination of messianic structure in favor of particular religious content. The analysis suggests that religious traditions achieve their deepest insights through sustained engagement with messianic structure that generates innovative religious thinking rather than systematic religious closure that eliminates temporal openness and religious creativity. The analysis extends to examine how secular political institutions operate through messianic structure while attempting to eliminate religious dimensions through rational institutional organization and democratic political procedures. Democratic political systems maintain temporal openness toward political possibilities that cannot be anticipated by current political knowledge or controlled through existing political institutions. This political openness operates through democratic commitment to ongoing political participation and institutional adaptation that prevents political systems from achieving complete systematic closure. Democratic politics reveals messianic temporal structure through commitment to political possibilities that exceed current political arrangements, while requiring ongoing political decision and institutional innovation that cannot be determined by existing political theory. However, the analysis of secular messianicity encounters objections regarding its implications for political theory and institutional analysis. Critics argue that treating democratic politics as essentially messianic in structure obscures important differences between rational political analysis and religious faith that democratic theory requires for legitimate political authority. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis of political messianicity undermines rather than enhances democratic political theory by eliminating rational foundations that distinguish legitimate political authority from arbitrary political power. The objection challenges whether messianic political analysis provides resources for democratic political evaluation rather than religious political framework that eliminates secular political rationality through appeal to non-rational political faith and political commitment that exceeds rational political justification. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how rational political evaluation itself depends on political commitments that exceed rational political calculation, while enabling rather than preventing effective political analysis and democratic political participation. Democratic political evaluation requires commitment to democratic values that cannot be rationally derived from non-democratic premises, while providing evaluative frameworks for rational political criticism and institutional political reform. These democratic commitments operate through temporal structure that remains open to unprecedented political challenges and emerging political possibilities rather than systematic political closure that eliminates need for ongoing political decision and institutional political adaptation. The analysis suggests that effective democratic politics requires acknowledgement of its messianic temporal structure rather than elimination of temporal openness through systematic political rationality that obscures political complexity and institutional political limitations. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of how contemporary global political challenges require forms of political commitment and institutional innovation that exceed current political theory and institutional political capacity. Environmental destruction, economic inequality, and cultural conflict create political problems that cannot be resolved through existing political institutions and established political procedures. These unprecedented political challenges require innovative political thinking and experimental institutional practices that maintain commitment to political justice while remaining open to political possibilities that exceed current political imagination. Global political challenges reveal how effective political response requires messianic political commitment that maintains temporal openness toward unprecedented political possibilities while engaging practically with current political constraints and institutional political limitations through strategic political action and innovative institutional political experimentation. Part 17. University and Responsibility: The Future of Knowledge. The modern university operates through structural tensions between autonomous intellectual inquiry and social utility that reveal broader relationships between knowledge production and institutional responsibility. Universities must maintain independence from political and economic pressures to enable critical intellectual work, while remaining accountable to social needs and public funding that make educational institutions possible. This tension creates what Derrida terms university without condition, that preserves intellectual freedom through institutional arrangements that cannot guarantee intellectual autonomy, while requiring ongoing negotiation between intellectual independence and social responsibility. The analysis reveals how knowledge production depends on institutional conditions that both enable and constrain intellectual activity, while requiring forms of intellectual responsibility that exceed both institutional requirements and abstract intellectual autonomy. The logical structure of university autonomy emerges through analysis of how critical intellectual work requires institutional protection from external political and economic control, while necessarily involving critical examination of social and political arrangements that provide institutional support. University research and teaching achieve their critical effectiveness through capacity to question established social arrangements, cultural assumptions, and political institutions without immediate concern for practical utility or social acceptance. This critical capacity requires institutional autonomy that enables intellectual work to operate according to intellectual rather than political or economic criteria. However, institutional autonomy depends on social and political arrangements that universities cannot establish independently, while subjecting these arrangements to critical intellectual analysis that may challenge their legitimacy and effectiveness. Derrida's analysis reveals how this structural relationship creates autoimmune logic, where universities must both protect and critique the social and political conditions that make university education possible. Critical intellectual work achieves its educational and cultural significance through capacity to examine social and political arrangements without predetermined conclusions, while necessarily depending on social and political support that critical analysis may call into question. This autoimmune structure prevents universities from achieving complete institutional autonomy or total social integration, while requiring ongoing negotiation between intellectual freedom and social responsibility that cannot be resolved through improved institutional arrangements. University education reveals how knowledge production operates through structural relationships between institutional protection and critical intellectual work that exceed systematic institutional solution, while enabling ongoing intellectual and educational activity. Consider how contemporary pressures for practical educational outcomes and economic utility affect university research and teaching in ways that both threaten and potentially enhance critical intellectual work. Economic demands for measurable educational outcomes and employable graduates create institutional pressures that may limit critical intellectual inquiry, while potentially connecting academic work to social and economic problems that require intellectual attention. These pressures reveal tension between intellectual values and social utility that cannot be resolved through complete elimination of either intellectual autonomy or social relevance. University education achieves its most valuable social effects through intellectual work that maintains critical distance from immediate social demands while engaging seriously with social and cultural problems that require intellectual analysis and innovative thinking. The analysis extends to examine how globalization affects university education through increasing international competition and cultural exchange that both threatens and creates opportunities for critical intellectual work. International academic competition may pressure universities to conform to standardized measures of academic excellence, while creating opportunities for intellectual exchange across cultural and linguistic boundaries that enhances critical intellectual capacity. Global university networks enable forms of collaborative intellectual work and cultural translation that exceed national educational traditions while potentially eliminating cultural differences through academic homogenization. Global university education requires institutional arrangements that maintain cultural specificity and intellectual diversity, while enabling international intellectual cooperation and cultural exchange that enhances rather than eliminates critical intellectual capacity and cultural understanding. However, this analysis of university globalization encounters objections regarding cultural imperialism and educational inequality that may result from international academic integration. Critics argue that global university networks reproduce, rather than challenge cultural hierarchies, by imposing Western educational models and intellectual approaches on cultural contexts that require different educational traditions and intellectual practices. This objection suggests that deconstructive university analysis provides theoretical justification for educational arrangements that eliminate cultural educational diversity through academic globalization that benefits economically privileged educational institutions. The objection challenges whether university analysis provides resources for educational justice rather than theoretical framework that obscures educational inequality through appeal to intellectual values that actually reflect particular cultural and economic advantages rather than universal educational ideals. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how effective university education requires forms of cultural translation and intellectual exchange that maintain cultural specificity while enabling intercultural intellectual cooperation and mutual cultural learning. University education achieves its critical effectiveness through capacity to engage with intellectual traditions and cultural perspectives that exceed local cultural boundaries, while maintaining attention to local cultural needs and specific intellectual traditions. This intercultural intellectual work requires educational practices that neither eliminate cultural differences through academic homogenization, nor isolate cultural traditions from intercultural intellectual exchange and collaborative intellectual development. The analysis suggests that responsible university education requires strategic engagement with educational globalization that maintains cultural educational diversity while enabling collaborative intellectual work that enhances rather than threatens cultural intellectual traditions and local educational capacity. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of how digital technologies affect university education by creating new possibilities for educational access and intellectual collaboration, while potentially altering fundamental educational relationships between teachers, students, and intellectual materials. Online education enables broader educational access and flexible educational arrangement, while potentially eliminating interpersonal educational relationships that may be essential for critical intellectual development. Digital educational technologies reveal how contemporary university education increasingly operates through technical mediations that both enhance and alter traditional educational practices and intellectual relationships. Educational technology requires careful analysis that maintains attention to educational values and intellectual goals while adapting educational practices to contemporary technical possibilities and social educational needs that exceed traditional educational arrangements and institutional educational capacity. The analysis illuminates how university research operates through relationships between specialized intellectual work and broader cultural and political concerns that cannot be resolved through either complete intellectual specialization or elimination of intellectual specialization in favor of immediate social utility. Effective intellectual research requires sustained attention to specific intellectual problems and specialized intellectual methods while maintaining awareness of broader intellectual and cultural significance that connects specialized research to general intellectual and cultural development. This relationship requires forms of intellectual responsibility that operate through engagement between specialized intellectual competence and broader intellectual and cultural concerns, rather than elimination of intellectual specialization or isolation of specialized research from general intellectual and cultural development. University research reveals how knowledge production achieves its greatest intellectual and cultural significance through intellectual work that maintains both specialized intellectual rigor and broader intellectual and cultural engagement that connects intellectual research to ongoing intellectual and cultural development and social intellectual needs that exceed specialized academic competence, while requiring specialized intellectual expertise for effective intellectual analysis and cultural understanding. Part 18. Literature and the Secret, the Literary Absolute. Literature operates through structural relationship with secrecy that cannot be resolved through interpretive revelation or critical analysis, revealing how literary meaning depends on remainders that exceed interpretive appropriation. The literary secret is not hidden content that careful reading can discover, but structural condition that enables literary meaning while preventing literary works from achieving interpretive transparency or systematic closure. This secrecy creates what Derrida terms literary absolute, that maintains interpretive inexhaustibility while enabling ongoing literary interpretation and cultural transmission across historical periods and cultural contexts. Literary secrecy reveals how cultural meaning operates through structural relationships between revelation and concealment that cannot be eliminated through improved interpretive methods or theoretical sophistication, while enabling forms of cultural understanding that exceed systematic cultural analysis. The logical structure of literary secrecy emerges through analysis of how literary works achieve meaning through linguistic and rhetorical strategies that both communicate and withhold meaning simultaneously. Literary language operates through metaphorical relationships, syntactic ambiguities, and rhetorical figures that generate multiple interpretive possibilities while preventing interpretive determination of single, correct literary meaning. These literary strategies are not obstacles to literary communication that better reading could eliminate, but structural characteristics that enable literary works to maintain cultural significance across different historical and cultural contexts. Literary secrecy reveals how meaningful cultural communication operates through structural indeterminacy that enables rather than prevents cultural understanding while requiring interpretive activity that cannot achieve complete cultural appropriation or systematic cultural closure. Derrida's analysis reveals how literary interpretation operates through relationship between reader and text that exceeds both subjective projection and objective textual determination. Literary reading requires active interpretive engagement that brings cultural and historical resources to literary encounter while remaining responsive to textual characteristics that resist interpretive appropriation. This interpretive relationship operates through temporal structure, where literary works affect present reading without becoming present interpretive content, creating literary experience that maintains temporal relationship with literary otherness across interpretive encounter. Literary interpretation reveals how cultural understanding operates through forms of cultural relationship that preserve rather than eliminate cultural otherness while enabling cultural communication and mutual cultural recognition that exceed both cultural assimilation and cultural isolation. Consider how literary works like Kafka's novels demonstrate literary secrecy through narrative strategies that generate interpretive possibilities while preventing interpretive resolution. Kafka's narratives present situations and characters that invite allegorical, psychological, and political interpretation, while resisting reduction to any single interpretive framework or systematic interpretive solution. The interpretive inexhaustibility enables Kafka's works to maintain cultural significance across different historical periods and cultural contexts that bring different interpretive resources and cultural concerns to literary encounter. Kafka's literary achievement demonstrates how literary secrecy enables rather than prevents cultural communication by creating literary works that remain open to cultural interpretation while providing sufficient textual resistance to sustain ongoing interpretive engagement and cultural transmission. The analysis extends to examine how literary translation operates through creative interpretation that both preserves and transforms literary meaning across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Literary translation requires interpretive decisions that determine how literary effects can be reproduced in different linguistic and cultural contexts, while necessarily altering literary works through adaptation to different linguistic resources and cultural frameworks. Successful literary translation achieves fidelity to literary works through creative linguistic innovation rather than mechanical linguistic equivalence that would eliminate cultural differences and linguistic specificity. Literary translation reveals how cultural communication operates through creative cultural interpretation that maintains cultural relationship across cultural differences, while enabling cultural understanding and mutual cultural recognition that exceed both cultural identity and cultural difference. However, the analysis of literary secrecy encounters objections regarding its implications for literary criticism and cultural understanding. Critics argue that emphasis on literary inexhaustibility undermines capacity for literary evaluation and cultural criticism by treating all literary interpretations as equally valid or equally inadequate. This objection suggests that deconstructive literary theory eliminates rather than enhances literary understanding by reducing literary meaning to infinite interpretive play that cannot distinguish between insightful and superficial literary interpretation. The objection challenges whether literary secrecy provides resources for literary criticism and cultural evaluation rather than relativistic literary theory that obscures literary value and cultural significance through emphasis on interpretive indeterminacy that eliminates standards for literary judgment and cultural discrimination. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how literary criticism achieves its greatest effectiveness through sustained attention to literary secrecy rather than interpretive strategies that attempt to eliminate literary indeterminacy through systematic literary analysis. Effective literary criticism requires careful attention to specific literary characteristics and textual details that reveal how literary works generate interpretive possibilities while resisting interpretive closure. This critical attention enables rather than prevents literary evaluation by revealing complex relationships between literary form and cultural meaning that superficial interpretation obscures through premature interpretive conclusions. Literary criticism demonstrates its cultural value through capacity to enhance rather than eliminate literary inexhaustibility by revealing interpretive possibilities that sustain ongoing cultural engagement with literary works rather than achieving interpretive closure that eliminates need for continuing cultural literary engagement. The argument's precision emerges through analysis of how contemporary digital culture affects literary production and literary reception through technological mediations that both threaten and create new possibilities for literary experience. Digital technologies enable new forms of literary production and distribution, while potentially altering reading practices and cultural relationships that may be essential for literary experience and cultural transmission. Electronic literature creates interactive and multimedia literary works that exceed traditional print literary forms while raising questions about literary boundaries and cultural literary continuity. Digital literary culture requires analysis that maintains attention to literary values and cultural literary significance, while remaining open to technological literary innovations and cultural changes that may enhance rather than threaten literary culture and cultural literary understanding. The analysis illuminates how literary education operates through pedagogical relationships between teachers, students, and literary works that cannot be reduced to information transmission or skill development, while requiring institutional arrangements that enable literary cultural transmission. Literary education achieves its cultural significance through capacity to enable forms of cultural relationship and interpretive engagement that exceed educational measurement, while requiring educational practices that can be institutionally supported and culturally sustained. This educational challenge requires pedagogical innovation that maintains literary cultural values while adapting to contemporary educational circumstances and cultural needs that exceed traditional literary educational practices. Literary education reveals how cultural transmission operates through institutional arrangements that both preserve and transform cultural traditions while enabling cultural innovation and cultural adaptation that sustain rather than eliminate cultural literary heritage and ongoing cultural literary development that connects literary cultural inheritance with contemporary cultural creativity and emerging cultural possibilities that exceed established cultural literary frameworks while remaining connected to cultural literary traditions that provide resources for innovative cultural literary development. Part 19. Psychoanalysis and the unconscious beyond the subject. Psychoanalysis reveals temporal structures of unconscious experience that challenge traditional philosophical concepts of self-present consciousness and unified personal identity. The unconscious operates through temporal logic that differs from conscious temporal experience while affecting conscious experience through symptoms, dreams, and linguistic formations that exceed conscious control and understanding. Derrida's analysis reveals how psychoanalytic discovery of unconscious temporality provides resources for understanding subjectivity as emergent effect of temporal processes rather than foundational origin of temporal experience. This analysis challenges both traditional philosophical emphasis on conscious self-presence and psychoanalytic attempts to achieve therapeutic mastery over unconscious processes through interpretive revelation and systematic psychoanalytic knowledge. The logical structure of unconscious temporality emerges through Freud's analysis of memory traces that operate through temporal relationships between past traumatic experience and present symptomatic expression. Traumatic memories affect present experience without becoming present conscious content, creating temporal relationships that exceed both conscious recollection and simple temporal causation. These memory traces operate through what Freud terms deferred action, where past traumatic significance emerges through present contexts that provide interpretive frameworks for understanding traumatic experience that was not available at the time of original traumatic occurrence. Deferred action reveals temporal structure where past and present operate through complex interpretive relationships that cannot be reduced to linear temporal causation or immediate temporal presence. Derrida's analysis reveals how this temporal structure connects psychoanalytic insights to broader deconstructive analysis of temporality and textual interpretation. Unconscious memory traces operate through inscriptional processes that maintain temporal relationship across temporal distance while preventing identical temporal repetition, creating temporal effects that resemble textual interpretation rather than mechanical temporal causation. The unconscious operates as psychical writing that generates meaningful effects through temporal relationships and interpretive processes that exceed conscious intention and systematic psychological control. Psychoanalytic discovery of unconscious temporality reveals how subjectivity emerges through textual and temporal processes rather than existing as foundational origin that controls textual and temporal relationships. However, this analysis of unconscious textuality encounters objections from psychoanalytic theory that emphasizes therapeutic effectiveness and clinical practical application. Critics argue that deconstructive psychoanalytic reading eliminates rather than enhances psychoanalytic therapeutic capacity by treating unconscious processes as textual effects rather than psychological realities that require clinical intervention and therapeutic change. This objection suggests that textual psychoanalytic interpretation obscures rather than illuminates psychological suffering and therapeutic possibility by reducing psychological problems to interpretive problems that cannot be resolved through psychoanalytic treatment. The objection challenges whether deconstructive psychoanalysis provides resources for therapeutic practice rather than theoretical psychoanalytic framework that eliminates clinical psychoanalytic effectiveness through abstract textual analysis that ignores psychological reality and therapeutic practical needs. Derrida's response operates through analysis of how psychoanalytic therapeutic effectiveness itself depends on textual and interpretive processes, rather than direct psychological intervention or systematic psychological knowledge. Psychoanalytic treatment operates through interpretive dialogue between analyst and analyst, and that generates new possibilities for understanding psychological experience rather than achieving direct access to unconscious psychological content. Therapeutic change emerges through interpretive processes that enable different relationships to unconscious processes rather than elimination of unconscious processes through conscious psychological mastery. The analysis suggests that understanding psychoanalytic treatment as textual and interpretive process enhances rather than eliminates therapeutic effectiveness. By revealing how therapeutic change operates through creative interpretation rather than mechanical psychological intervention or systematic psychological control that reproduces rather than transforms problematic psychological relationships. The argument extends to examine how psychoanalytic insights illuminate broader cultural and political phenomena through analysis of collective unconscious processes and social symptom formation. Cultural symptoms like racism, nationalism, and ideological commitment operate through unconscious processes that affect social and political behavior while remaining resistant to conscious political analysis and rational political criticism. These collective unconscious processes require forms of cultural and political analysis that can address unconscious cultural and political investments rather than treating cultural and political problems as purely conscious rational problems that can be resolved through improved rational political analysis and better political information. Psychoanalytic cultural analysis reveals how effective cultural and political criticism requires attention to unconscious cultural and political processes that exceed rational political analysis while affecting rational political behavior and conscious political commitment through unconscious cultural and political mechanisms. Consider how contemporary political movements demonstrate unconscious investment in fantasies of cultural purity and national identity that exceed rational political analysis while affecting political behavior and policy preferences. These political fantasies operate through unconscious identification processes that provide psychological satisfaction and cultural belonging, while potentially conflicting with conscious political values and rational political interests. Political fantasy reveals how political behavior operates through unconscious psychological processes that cannot be changed through rational political argumentation alone, while requiring forms of political analysis and political intervention that can address unconscious political investment and psychological political satisfaction. Psychoanalytic political analysis suggests that effective political change requires cultural and political practices that can address unconscious political processes, rather than treating political problems as purely rational political problems that can be resolved through improved political information and better rational political argumentation that ignores unconscious political investment and psychological political attachment. However, the extension of psychoanalytic analysis to cultural and political phenomena encounters objections regarding the legitimacy of applying individual psychological concepts to collective social and political processes. Critics argue that psychoanalytic cultural analysis inappropriately reduces social and political problems to psychological problems while ignoring material social and political conditions that require institutional political intervention rather than therapeutic cultural response. This objection suggests that psychoanalytic political theory obscures rather than illuminates political problems by treating institutional political problems as psychological cultural problems that cannot be resolved through institutional political reform and systematic political change. The objection challenges whether psychoanalytic cultural analysis provides resources for effective political understanding rather than psychological political theory that eliminates attention to material political conditions and institutional political arrangements that require practical political intervention and systematic institutional political reform rather than therapeutic cultural analysis and psychological political interpretation. Derrida addresses this challenge through analysis of how institutional political arrangements and material political conditions operate through cultural and psychological processes that cannot be understood through purely institutional political analysis or material political theory. Political institutions achieve their effectiveness through cultural legitimacy and psychological investment that exceed institutional political procedures while enabling institutional political functioning and popular political support. This cultural and psychological dimension does not eliminate institutional political analysis, but requires political understanding that can address relationships between institutional political arrangements and cultural psychological processes that both sustain and potentially transform institutional political relationships. The analysis suggests that effective political understanding requires integration of institutional political analysis with cultural and psychological political analysis, rather than elimination of either institutional or psychological political understanding through theoretical political approaches that ignore complex relationships between institutional political conditions and cultural psychological political processes that affect institutional political effectiveness and popular political support, while potentially enabling innovative institutional political development and democratic political transformation that addresses both institutional political limitations and cultural psychological political obstacles to democratic political reform and inclusive political community development. Part 20. Legacy and Future: The Continuing Work of Deconstruction. Deconstruction's continuing work operates through dissemination across intellectual disciplines and cultural practices that both extend and transform deconstructive insights while revealing new analytical possibilities and institutional resistances. The concepts developed through Derrida's philosophical analysis have migrated into literary criticism, political theory, legal analysis, cultural studies, and theological reflection in ways that exceed original philosophical intentions while remaining connected to fundamental deconstructive questions. This institutional and cultural spread demonstrates how deconstructive analysis illuminates structural problems that operate across different domains of human activity while creating new theoretical challenges and practical applications that test deconstructive concepts against empirical complexity and institutional constraints. The continuing work reveals how philosophical thinking achieves cultural significance through institutional transformation rather than abstract theoretical completion, while remaining subject to cultural interpretation and institutional adaptation that both preserves and alters original philosophical insights. The logical structure of deconstructive dissemination operates through what Derrida terms iterative transformation, where deconstructive concepts maintain analytical effectiveness while undergoing modification through application to new theoretical problems and institutional contexts. Literary criticism has developed sophisticated reading practices that attend to textual complexity and interpretive indeterminacy without abandoning evaluative judgment or cultural discrimination. Legal theory has incorporated attention to interpretive undecidability and institutional aporias while maintaining commitment to legal determinacy and judicial responsibility. Political analysis has engaged with democratic impossibility and constitutional paradox while pursuing practical democratic reform and inclusive political participation. These disciplinary applications reveal how deconstructive analysis provides analytical tools rather than systematic theoretical doctrine, enabling innovative theoretical work while preventing theoretical closure around deconstructive orthodoxy. The analytical effectiveness emerges through creative application to specific theoretical problems rather than mechanical repetition of deconstructive formulas or concepts. This application process generates new theoretical insights and institutional practices that exceed original deconstructive framework while remaining recognizably connected to fundamental deconstructive concerns with temporal complexity, structural indeterminacy, and ethical responsibility. The dissemination reveals how philosophical thinking achieves its greatest cultural influence through theoretical creativity that transforms rather than preserves original philosophical insights, while maintaining connection to philosophical problems that generated original theoretical innovation. However, this process of deconstructive dissemination encounters systematic objections that challenge both theoretical adequacy and practical utility of deconstructive analysis. Critics argue that deconstructive emphasis on structural indeterminacy and institutional aporias leads to theoretical paralysis that cannot provide guidance for practical decision-making or institutional reform. This objection suggests that deconstructive analysis eliminates rather than enhances capacity for rational evaluation and effective action by revealing complexity that exceeds practical resolution. The criticism gains force by noting how deconstructive analysis appears to treat all institutional arrangements and theoretical positions as equally subject to internal contradiction and systematic failure, thereby eliminating resources for discriminating between better and worse theoretical and practical alternatives. A related objection focuses on what critics term deconstructive textualism, that allegedly reduces all experience to linguistic and interpretive relationships while ignoring material conditions, institutional power, and embodied experience that require non-textual analysis and practical intervention. This criticism argues that deconstructive focus on language and interpretation obscures rather than illuminates social inequality, political domination, and environmental destruction that require material analysis and institutional reform rather than interpretive sophistication. The objection challenges whether deconstructive analysis provides adequate resources for understanding and addressing concrete social problems rather than theoretical framework that substitutes interpretive complexity for practical political engagement and material social analysis. Critics suggest that deconstructive theoretical sophistication functions as form of intellectual privilege that avoids rather than enables effective social and political criticism and institutional social reform. Derrida's response to these systematic objections operates through analysis of how practical effectiveness and theoretical adequacy require rather than eliminate attention to structural complexity and institutional contradiction. Recognition of structural indeterminacy and institutional aporias enables, rather than prevents, effective practical engagement by revealing contingency of apparently natural institutional arrangements and theoretical assumptions. This recognition creates opportunities for innovative practical response and creative institutional reform rather than eliminating capacity for practical judgment and effective action. The analysis suggests that most effective practical engagement requires understanding of practical complexity rather than simplified theoretical frameworks that obscure institutional complexity through theoretical reduction that eliminates attention to structural conditions that both enable and constrain practical effectiveness and theoretical adequacy. Regarding the textualism objection, Derrida's analysis reveals how attention to linguistic and interpretive processes enhances rather than eliminates capacity for material analysis and practical intervention. Material conditions achieve social and political significance through interpretive frameworks and cultural practices that determine how material conditions affect social experience and political possibility. Social inequality and political domination operate through ideological processes and cultural practices that require interpretive analysis for effective political criticism and social reform. The analysis suggests that effective material analysis requires attention to interpretive and cultural processes through which material conditions achieve social significance and political effectiveness, rather than material analysis that ignores cultural and interpretive mediation through which material conditions affect social experience and enable political intervention and social institutional change. Contemporary developments in deconstructive analysis demonstrate ongoing theoretical productivity through engagement with new technological, environmental, and global political challenges that test deconstructive concepts against unprecedented theoretical problems and practical situations. Digital technologies create new forms of temporal experience, cultural transmission, and social relationship that require deconstructive analysis while potentially exceeding traditional deconstructive frameworks developed through analysis of print culture and territorial political organization. Environmental destruction and climate change create unprecedented political challenges that require forms of ethical and political thinking that can address relationships between human cultural development and natural environmental conditions. Global economic and cultural interdependence creates political problems that exceed territorial democratic institutions, while requiring democratic political innovation that maintains democratic values across cultural and institutional boundaries. These contemporary challenges reveal both continuing relevance and potential limitations of deconstructive analysis, while creating opportunities for innovative theoretical development that extends deconstructive insights into new theoretical domains. Digital culture demonstrates accelerated processes of cultural reproduction and transformation that may require analysis of temporal relationships that exceed human-centered temporal frameworks while remaining connected to questions of cultural meaning and ethical responsibility. Environmental crisis requires forms of ethical thinking that can address relationships between human cultural activity and non-human natural processes without reducing either to the other. Global political challenges require political analysis that can address cultural difference and institutional diversity while maintaining commitment to inclusive political participation and democratic political values that exceed particular cultural and institutional traditions. The analysis of these contemporary developments reveals what remains unthought within deconstructive analysis, while indicating directions for continuing theoretical work that extends rather than simply applies deconstructive concepts. The relationship between deconstructive temporal analysis and scientific understanding of evolutionary and ecological temporal processes requires theoretical work that can integrate deconstructive insights with empirical scientific analysis without reducing either to the other. The relationship between deconstructive analysis of cultural difference and anthropological understanding of cultural diversity requires theoretical framework that can address cultural translation and intercultural understanding without eliminating cultural specificity or reducing cultural difference to interpretive variation within universal cultural structure. The relationship between deconstructive political analysis and institutional political science requires political theory that can address institutional complexity and political effectiveness, while maintaining attention to political values and democratic ideals that exceed institutional realization and systematic political determination. However, the projection of continuing deconstructive development encounters the fundamental question of whether deconstructive analysis can maintain its critical effectiveness while achieving institutional acceptance and cultural influence. Academic institutionalization of deconstructive theory may eliminate rather than preserve critical analytical capacity by transforming innovative theoretical insights into academic orthodoxy that reproduces rather than challenges established intellectual and institutional arrangements. Cultural dissemination of deconstructive concepts may reduce analytical precision to popular slogans that eliminate theoretical complexity while claiming deconstructive authority for theoretical and practical positions that contradict fundamental deconstructive insights. The challenge reveals how theoretical effectiveness requires ongoing creative theoretical work rather than institutional preservation of established theoretical achievements. While institutional support enables rather than threatens theoretical innovation when institutional arrangements remain open to theoretical development that exceeds institutional anticipation and control. The continuing work of deconstruction operates most effectively through what Derrida terms institutional responsibility, that maintains critical analytical capacity while engaging constructively with institutional arrangements and cultural practices that enable intellectual work and cultural transmission. This responsibility requires strategic engagement with institutional arrangements that both preserves critical theoretical effectiveness and contributes to institutional practices that enhance rather than eliminate intellectual freedom and cultural creativity. Institutional responsibility operates through forms of intellectual and cultural activity that maintain commitment to theoretical innovation and cultural criticism while remaining responsive to institutional constraints and cultural needs that require practical engagement and institutional reform rather than abstract theoretical criticism that ignores institutional and cultural complexity. The analysis suggests that most effective continuing theoretical work requires forms of intellectual responsibility that can address relationships between theoretical innovation and institutional development, cultural criticism and cultural contribution, analytical sophistication and practical effectiveness in ways that enhance rather than eliminate both theoretical insight and practical cultural and institutional development that sustains intellectual work while remaining open to intellectual innovation that exceeds established intellectual and institutional arrangements and cultural practices that may limit rather than enhance intellectual and cultural creativity and social intellectual responsibility. The future of deconstructive thinking depends not on systematic theoretical completion, but on ongoing creative theoretical response to unprecedented intellectual and cultural challenges that require analytical innovation while remaining connected to fundamental philosophical questions that generated original deconstructive insights. This continuing work operates through forms of philosophical responsibility that maintain commitment to analytical precision and cultural understanding while remaining responsive to intellectual and cultural developments that exceed established philosophical frameworks and cultural arrangements. The work continues,